I am Malcolm, 75 years old, and a man who spent his entire life building a fortress to protect his family. But what happens when the enemies are already inside the gates? I returned home 3 days early from a trip only to find my wife of 50 years lying in the intensive care unit fighting for her very breath. Yet outside her glass room, my son and his wife were not weeping. They were sipping iced matchas and casually shopping for real estate. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply pulled out my phone and quietly locked every single bank account they had access to. The panic on their faces a few minutes later was something I will never forget. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders should come with a heavy price. The damp chill of the North Georgia mountains was still clinging to my jacket when I walked through the sliding glass doors of Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. I was supposed to be at a quiet veterans fishing retreat until Sunday, but a confusing and panicked voicemail from my next-door neighbor told me an ambulance had taken my wife Gloria away in the middle of the night. My chest was tight. My knees ached with every step on that sterile linoleum floor. The harsh fluorescent lights above buzzed with a sickening energy. Gloria was my rock, my compass, the only woman who ever looked at a tired electrician covered in dust and saw a king. When I finally reached the intensive care unit, my breath caught in my throat. Through the heavy glass window I saw her, my beautiful Gloria. She was pale and motionless, surrounded by monitors that beeped with a terrifying, relentless rhythm. A thick plastic tube was pushed down her throat, breathing for her. My heart shattered right there in the hallway. I placed my calloused hand against the cold glass, whispering a silent prayer to a God I hoped was listening. I expected to find a waiting room full of tears and frantic energy. I expected to find my family broken by this sudden tragedy. But the true nightmare was not just inside that hospital room. It was sitting on the waiting lounge leather sofa just 10 feet away. My son Julian and his wife Sloan. They were not holding each other in grief. They were not talking to the doctors or pacing the floor in agony. They were sitting comfortably with their legs crossed, sipping large green iced drinks. I stood in the shadows of the hallway just watching them. Sloan was holding a large silver tablet, her manicured fingers swiping rapidly across the screen. Julian leaned over her shoulder, nodding in agreement at whatever they were looking at. I squinted, focusing my tired eyes on the bright screen. It was not a medical website. It was not an update on hospital procedures or a prayer group page. They were looking at architectural blueprints for luxury condo remodels. My blood turned to ice. For years I had watched Sloan look down her narrow nose at me and Gloria. She was a real estate agent who came from a loud, flashy family that loved to wear designer clothes and drive leased luxury cars to project a level of wealth they did not actually have. She saw me as just an old, uneducated blue-collar worker, a guy who spent 40 years pulling wires, laying conduit, and breathing in drywall dust in commercial skyscrapers downtown. Whenever she visited our house, she complained about the old-fashioned furniture or made passive-aggressive remarks about my worn-out work boots sitting by the front door. She treated me like a dim-witted peasant who was incredibly lucky to have her sophisticated white-collar presence in his home. She had no idea, absolutely no idea. Sloan thought Julian was the successful one because he wore a tailored suit to a mid-level bank management job every morning. She never knew that the man she openly mocked had quietly built a massive commercial contracting empire. She did not know that when I finally sold my electrical company, I buried a multi-million-dollar fortune in blind trusts and diversified real estate portfolios. To her, I was just a walking pension check waiting to expire. She thought she was the smartest person in any room, especially when that room included an old black man with rough hands and a quiet demeanor. I did not rush toward them. In my younger days serving in the military, I learned that the best way to gather intelligence is to move quietly and observe the enemy when they are completely relaxed and think they are safe. I walked slowly, letting the soft rubber soles of my boots absorb the sound of my footsteps. The hospital corridor was relatively quiet except for the hum of the vending machines and the distant intercom announcements calling for doctors. Julian took a long sip of his iced matcha and pointed at a specific detail on the tablet. I moved closer, stepping behind a large potted plant that separated their seating area from the main walkway. They were so utterly engrossed in planning their upgraded lifestyle that they did not even bother to look up and check on the woman fighting for her life just a few yards away. My own son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy whose expensive college tuition I paid for in pure cash, was sitting there treating his dying mother like an inconvenient stepping stone to a better kitchen island. The betrayal tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. I remembered all the overtime shifts I worked just so Julian could have the newest sneakers and fit in with the wealthy kids at his private school. I remembered Gloria staying up late baking pies for his bake sales. And this was how he repaid her, by waiting for her to die so he could upgrade his countertops. I took another step, bringing myself right to the edge of the seating area just out of their peripheral vision. I held my breath and listened. The hospital noises faded into the background as Sloane leaned closer to Julian. Her voice was a sharp, harsh whisper, but I heard every single word with crystal clarity. "If she does not make it past tomorrow, probate is actually going to be a lot faster," she said, her tone completely devoid of any human empathy. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he did not stop her. He did not defend his mother or tell his wife to show some respect. He just stared at the screen. Sloane tapped her long acrylic nail against the glass of the tablet. "We just need to make sure your senile dad signs the primary deed over to my real estate brokerage before the end of the month. I already have all the paperwork drafted and ready to go in my bag. He does not read anything anyway. He is too old to understand the legal jargon. He will just sign wherever I tell him to sign." The absolute audacity of her words hung in the air like a poisonous fog. She was actively planning to steal the home I built with my own 2 hands before my wife was even cold in her hospital bed. And my son, the coward I raised, was sitting there letting her do it. The deep sadness that had gripped my chest when I first walked into the intensive care unit evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, highly calculating rage. The kind of rage that does not yell or throw punches. The kind of rage that quietly dismantles a person's entire life piece by piece. I stepped out from the shadows of the potted plant and stood directly in front of them, blocking the harsh fluorescent light from above. The shadows fell heavy across their faces. I looked down at the tablet showing the expensive remodeling plans. Then I looked up into their suddenly terrified wide eyes. My voice was low, steady, and carried the heavy weight of an oncoming storm. "Who exactly is signing what?" Sloane gasped. The sudden sharp intake of air was so dramatic it echoed loudly in the quiet hospital corridor. The heavy silver tablet slipped from her manicured fingers and clattered onto the hard linoleum floor, sliding until it hit the leg of the waiting room chairs. In an instant, the cold, calculating woman who was just plotting to steal my home vanished completely. In her place was a weeping, hysterical daughter-in-law putting on a performance worthy of a National Theater Award. She covered her face with both of her hands, sobbing loudly and rocking her shoulders back and forth. "Oh, Malcolm," she cried out, her voice shaking with fake devastation. "It was so sudden. Gloria just collapsed. The doctor said it was a massive heart attack. We have been sitting here for hours just praying for a miracle." I did not look at her. I shifted my gaze to my son. Julian. The boy I raised to be a strong man. The boy I had sacrificed my own youth and energy for. He could not even look me in the eye. He stared down at his expensive Italian leather shoes, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. He stammered something quietly about how fast the ambulance came and how the doctors were doing everything they could to stabilize her condition. His voice was weak, pathetic. He sounded like a little boy who had just been caught stealing candy, not a 42-year-old man whose mother was fighting for her life on the other side of that glass wall. I stood there letting the heavy silence stretch out between us. I let them squirm in the uncomfortable weight of my stare. I did not yell. I did not demand an explanation for the luxury condo blueprints I had just seen them reviewing. Yelling is what weak people do when they have lost control of a situation. And I was completely in control. The hospital air felt thick and stale, smelling faintly of bleach and medicine. Sloane continued her theatrical sobbing, occasionally peeking through the gaps in her fingers to see if I was buying her grief-stricken act. I reached slowly into the inside breast pocket of my jacket. My hands did not shake. My heart rate did not spike. I pulled out my phone and unlocked the screen. I did not dial a family member to spread the bad news. I did not call our local pastor to come and pray over my wife. I scrolled steadily through my contacts until I found the direct private number for my senior wealth manager at Merrill Lynch. Julian looked up from his shoes, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What are you doing, Dad?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly in the quiet hallway. "Are you calling the rest of the family to tell them about Mom?" I did not answer him. I brought the phone up and held it to my ear. It rang twice before a crisp, elegant voice answered on the other end. "Good evening, Mr. Reed. How can I assist you tonight?" Sloane stopped crying immediately. Her hands dropped away from her perfectly made-up face. The sudden dead silence from her was absolutely deafening. She stared at me, her eyes darting frantically between the phone pressed to my ear and my stoic, unreadable expression. She knew I did not have a regular checking account at a local branch, but she always assumed I just had a simple, modest retirement fund from my days pulling electrical wires. She had absolutely no idea who I was calling, but her survival instincts were rapidly kicking in. She could sense the massive shift in the atmosphere. I spoke clearly and deliberately into the receiver, making sure my deep voice carried over to the waiting room sofa. "This is Malcolm Reed. I need to make immediate emergency changes to the primary family trust. Yes, right now. Right. I need you to completely revoke Julian Reed's signatory access to the $15,000 a month living allowance, effective immediately. Lock him out of the portal." Julian's face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray. He took a clumsy step forward, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish pulled out of the water. "Dad, wait," he gasped, grabbing the air between us. "What are you talking about? What trust fund? You cannot do this right now." I ignored his pathetic pleading and continued speaking to my wealth manager, my eyes locked dead onto Sloane's pale face. "Furthermore, I need you to instantly cancel all platinum credit cards issued under my corporate umbrella, specifically the cards ending in 4821 and 7003. Yes, the ones currently held by Sloane Reed. Freeze the accounts, lock them down entirely, and decline any pending wire transfers that have not yet cleared the Federal Reserve." Julian was practically hyperventilating now, his chest heaving under his tailored suit jacket. "Dad, you cannot do that," he panicked. He reached out to grab my arm, but I gave him a look so intensely cold it froze him in his tracks. "We are in the middle of a massive kitchen remodel, Dad. We have professional contractors working at the house right now, tearing up the floors. The custom marble countertops are being delivered tomorrow morning. How are we supposed to pay for the marble island? We will be completely ruined. The contractors will walk off the job and sue us." I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, ending the call. I looked at the boy I had sacrificed so much for, the boy who only cared about his image, his status, and keeping his greedy wife happy. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing softly against the hospital walls. "My wife is dying. You do not need a marble island." The reality of the situation crashed down on them with the weight of a collapsing building. The invisible financial safety net they had been comfortably living on for years was permanently gone in less than 60 seconds. Then the tense silence was broken by a sharp, aggressive buzzing sound. Sloane's phone vibrated wildly on the glass coffee table where she had dropped her tablet. She snatched it up, her eyes widening in pure terror as she read the incoming text message on the screen. It was her lead construction contractor. The $40,000 wire transfer she had initiated that very morning to pay for the remodel had just bounced. The bank had violently rejected it due to frozen funds. The workers were packing up their tools and walking off the job site immediately. The mask completely slipped off Sloane's face. The fake tears dried up in an instant, replaced by a venomous, ugly sneer. Her perfect posture went rigid and her face contorted with pure, unfiltered rage. She finally realized the game had changed entirely. The old man she thought she could easily manipulate and outsmart had just cut off her lifeblood without shedding a single tear. She threw her phone into her expensive designer bag and began digging frantically inside it, tossing makeup and keys aside. "You think you are so smart?" she hissed, her voice dripping with absolute poison. "You think you can just cut us off and run this family like some kind of dictator because you have a little bit of money hidden away?" She pulled her hand out of the bag. In her fist, she held a thick, folded legal document stamped with a bright red notary seal. She held it up, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. A sick, triumphant smile spread across her face. "You think you run this family, old man?" she whispered maliciously, stepping closer to me. "Well, you are wrong." Sloane slammed the thick legal document onto the glass coffee table in the hospital waiting room. The sharp sound cracked through the quiet, sterile space like a gunshot, making a passing nurse jump in surprise. I did not flinch. I just stared down at the crisp white paper resting on the glass. It had a bright red notary seal stamped aggressively at the very bottom, proving it was an official legal record. Across the top, in bold black letters, it read "Medical Power of Attorney." My eyes moved slowly from the printed paper back up to her face. She was no longer pretending to cry. Her fake tears had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Her lips were curled into a cruel, triumphant smile. She pointed a long, sharp acrylic nail directly at the signature line. It was Gloria's signature. My wife's handwriting was slightly shaky from her age, but it was unmistakably hers. I asked her in a low, steady voice exactly what she had done. Sloane laughed, a dry, hollow sound that held absolutely no warmth or humanity. She proudly explained that 2 weeks ago, while I was out of the house meeting with some electrical contractors, she had come over for a surprise visit. She brought a large stack of papers and told Gloria they were just routine insurance updates required for the new year. My sweet, trusting wife, who always wanted to believe in the good of her family, had smiled and offered her tea. She had signed every single page without putting on her reading glasses to check the fine print. She signed away her own voice. She signed away my right to protect her, and she gave complete, absolute medical authority over her own life to Julian. Sloane looked me dead in the eye and said that I no longer had any say in what happened in that hospital. She told me I was just a spectator now and that Julian was the one in charge of his mother's fate. The sheer level of calculation was staggering. She had not just reacted to a sudden, unexpected medical emergency. She had been preparing for it. She had been laying a trap for my wife. Before I could even fully process the terrible weight of her deception, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open. The attending physician walked out into the waiting area. His face was drawn tight with extreme exhaustion, and his expression was incredibly grim. He held a metal medical clipboard against his chest and asked in a tired voice to speak to the person holding the legal medical proxy for Gloria Reed. I instinctively stepped forward, my heart pounding furiously against my ribs. I am her husband of over 50 years, I told him, my voice cracking just a little. But Sloane moved much faster. She snatched the document off the table and shoved the notarized paper right into the doctor's chest. She announced loudly that her husband Julian held the sole legal authority and that I was absolutely not to be consulted on any medical matters. The doctor looked taken aback by her aggressive tone. He adjusted his glasses and carefully reviewed the red seal and the signature. He nodded slowly, looking at me with deep sympathy. He apologized to me in a quiet voice, but stated that legally he had to defer to the official document in his hands. I swallowed, the burning rage rising in my throat, and demanded that he at least tell us what was happening to my wife. The doctor looked at Julian, who was still staring at the floor, and delivered a devastating update. Gloria's condition was not just a simple heart attack like Sloane had claimed earlier. Her kidneys were failing rapidly. Her liver enzymes were spiking to incredibly dangerous levels. The doctor explained that they had run a full toxicology screen and found evidence of a mysterious chemical interaction in her bloodstream. Something highly toxic was shutting down her major organs from the inside out. He said they were doing everything they possibly could to flush her system, but her frail body was growing weaker by the minute. Then came the absolute death sentence. The doctor looked directly at Julian and said that if her vitals did not show significant natural improvement in the next 48 hours, her organs would completely shut down beyond repair. If that happened, they would need Julian to step up and make the incredibly difficult decision to terminate life support. 48 hours. 2 short days. That was all the time my beautiful wife had left before her own cowardly son could legally pull the plug and let her suffocate. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the hospital hallway as the doctor turned around and walked back through the intensive care doors. Julian finally lifted his head and looked up. He did not look devastated by the news that his mother was dying. He actually looked relieved. It was the sickening look of a desperate man who just realized his massive financial problems were only 2 days away from disappearing forever. The terrible thought of them casually murdering my wife just so they could pay for their luxury lifestyle in their marble kitchen island snapped something deep inside my brain. I lunged forward. I reached out with my rough hands to snatch that fraudulent piece of paper right out of Sloane's manicured grip. I wanted to rip it into 1,000 tiny pieces and throw it right in her smug, arrogant face. But as I moved forward, Julian stepped directly into my path. He raised both of his hands and shoved me hard in the center of my chest. I stumbled backward, my heavy work boots squeaking loudly against the polished hospital floor. I caught my balance against the wall and stared at him in pure, absolute disbelief. My 75-year-old bones ached from the sudden aggressive impact, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the emotional blow. The boy I had protected my entire life, the boy I had carried on my shoulders and bailed out of every financial mistake he ever made, had just violently laid his hands on me. Julian puffed out his chest, trying his best to look intimidating. He pointed a shaking finger right at my face and told me to back off. He said it was his call now. He looked me right in the eyes and said, "We have to let her go peacefully, Dad. We have to do what is best for everyone." He actually believed he was the one in charge. He was standing there hiding behind a piece of paper, and his manipulative wife telling me to my face that he was going to execute my Gloria. Every single instinct I had developed as a young man serving in the military told me to drop him to the floor right then and there. I wanted to grab him by his expensive silk tie and drag him down the hallway until he begged for mercy. I wanted to show him that an old blue-collar worker still had far more strength in his hands than a cowardly bank manager ever would. But I am not a stupid man. I am a survivor who built an empire by calculating every single risk. I realized in that split second that physical force would not win this battle. If I threw a punch, hospital security would tackle me to the ground. The local police would be called immediately. I would be arrested for assault and thrown into a dirty holding cell for the night. And while I was sitting helpless behind metal bars, Julian and Sloan would be completely free to tell the doctors to turn off Gloria's life support machines. Violence was exactly what they wanted from me. They wanted me to look like a crazy, aggressive old man who had lost his mind so they could justify keeping me away. I absolutely refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. I slowly lowered my hands to my sides. I took a deep breath and smoothed out the front of my jacket. I looked at Julian and then at Sloan, taking one last long look at their smug faces, burning their expressions deep into my memory. I did not say another word to either of them. I simply turned my back on them and began walking slowly down the long, fluorescent hospital corridor. I needed to find a lawyer immediately. I needed to find a massive legal loophole to break that proxy contract before the 48-hour clock ran out. But as I finally reached the automatic sliding glass doors leading out to the parking garage, I felt a sharp, heavy vibration in my jacket pocket. It was not a phone call. It was a high-priority emergency alert. I pulled out my phone and looked down at the bright screen. My secure offline home network application was flashing a bright warning red. The hidden security system I had personally hardwired into my house was sending me a critical warning. The text on the screen read, "Motion detected in the master bedroom. Someone was inside my house right now. Someone was actively digging through my most private personal space at the exact same moment my wife was dying in a hospital bed." And looking at the flashing red light on my screen, I knew exactly what they were looking for. The drive back from the hospital was a blur of gray asphalt and simmering silent rage. My knuckles were pale against the leather steering wheel of my truck, and I did not bother turning on the radio. The only sound in the cabin was the heavy thumping of my own heart beating against my ribs. I had just left the woman I love breathing through a thick plastic tube, while my own flesh and blood plotted her execution for a real estate commission. When I finally turned onto the long paved driveway of my estate, I saw exactly what I feared. Two sleek white luxury sedans were parked carelessly on my beautifully manicured front lawn. They did not belong to my neighbors, and they certainly did not belong to me. They belonged to the vultures. I parked my heavy truck right behind them, blocking them in completely so they could not escape. I stepped out and walked up the stone steps to my front door. The lock had not been forced, but I knew Sloan had simply swiped the spare key from my son's keychain. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The house I had built to be a quiet sanctuary for my family was buzzing with unfamiliar, arrogant voices. I walked quietly toward the living room and stopped in the archway. Two young women dressed in sharp, expensive business suits were standing in the middle of my imported Persian rug. One of them was holding a digital laser tape measure, clicking it against the walls to calculate the square footage of the room. The other was holding a professional camera, snapping bright flash photos of my antique mahogany dining table. They were talking loudly about how much natural light the room got and how quickly they could flip the property if they staged it with modern minimalist furniture. They were actively preparing to sell my home while my wife was still fighting for her life in a hospital bed. I stood there in the doorway for a long moment, letting the absolute disrespect wash over me. Then I cleared my throat, letting the deep sound echo through the high ceilings of the living room. Both women jumped, spinning around to face me in shock. The one with the camera lowered it quickly, her face flushing with sudden deep embarrassment. She stammered out a weak apology, saying that Sloan had sent them to do a preliminary appraisal for an upcoming listing. I did not raise my voice because I did not need to. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps into the room and told them they had exactly 30 seconds to pack up their equipment and get off my property before I locked the front door and called the county sheriff to arrest them both for felony trespassing. They tried to argue, telling me that Sloan was their managing broker and she had officially authorized this visit. I looked the speaker dead in the eye and told her Sloan did not own the dirt under her shoes, let alone the walls of my house. They saw the cold, dead, serious look in my eyes and immediately realized I was not bluffing. They scrambled to gather their bags, tripped over the edge of the rug, and ran out the front door without another word. I heard their car engines start up and tear down the driveway. Then the house fell completely silent. The quiet was heavy and oppressive, pressing down on my shoulders. I did not sit down to rest. I walked straight down the hallway and pushed open the heavy wooden door to the master bathroom. I went straight to the marble vanity where Gloria kept her daily pill organizer. It was sitting exactly where it always did, right next to the sink. I picked it up and opened the small plastic compartments. They were completely empty. Not a single trace of her heart medication or her daily vitamins remained. I brought the plastic container close to my face and inhaled deeply. It did not smell like medicine. It smelled faintly of industrial bleach. Someone had not just emptied it to hide the evidence. They had scrubbed it. They had sterilized it to completely remove any chemical residue. Sloan thought she was dealing with an old, uneducated fool. She looked at my gray hair and my calloused working hands and assumed I was just a tech-illiterate boomer who needed help turning on a smart television. She thought her little real estate tricks and her smooth-talking lawyers made her completely untouchable. She assumed that because there were no cheap plastic wireless cameras sitting on the bookshelves, my house was completely blind. She did not know my history and she never bothered to ask. She did not know that for 3 decades I was a master commercial electrician. I built the secure network infrastructures for government buildings and high-tech corporate headquarters downtown. I knew exactly how easily a wireless security signal could be hacked, jammed, or erased by anyone with a decent smartphone and a basic internet connection. So when I built this estate, I did not buy a basic security system from a retail store. I designed and installed a custom offline closed-circuit network. I ran miles of shielded copper wire through the thick walls beneath the hardwood floorboards and deep into the structural architecture of the house. I installed military-grade microcameras directly inside the metal grates of the heating and cooling vents in every single room. They were completely invisible to the naked eye and totally undetectable by any wireless scanner, because they did not emit a single radio frequency. They recorded everything 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, feeding directly into a localized analog system that could never be accessed from the outside world. Sloan thought she could walk into my home and commit a terrible crime without leaving a digital footprint. She was dead wrong. I left the sterilized pill container on the bathroom counter and walked out to the main hallway. I opened the heavy wooden door leading to the basement and slowly walked down the wooden stairs. The air down here was much cooler, smelling faintly of motor oil and aged cedar wood. I flipped the light switch illuminating the massive concrete room. Along the far wall sat a row of heavy steel tool cabinets where I kept my vintage electrical equipment. I walked over to the largest cabinet in the dark corner. It weighed several hundred pounds, but I knew the exact leverage point to push. I put my shoulder against the steel frame and shoved hard with my legs. The entire cabinet slid smoothly to the left on hidden metal tracks, revealing a small recessed alcove carved directly into the thick concrete foundation. Inside the alcove sat a quiet, humming black server rack. It was the digital heart of my home. I pulled up a wooden stool and sat down in front of it. I flipped the power switch on the monitor and watched the screen flicker to life. A grid of 16 different camera angles appeared, illuminating the dark basement with a cold, sharp blue glow. I reached for the wired computer mouse and clicked on the main archive security folder. I carefully selected the date for the night before I left for my fishing trip. Then I scrolled down and double-clicked on the camera feed labeled Kitchen Overhead. The screen expanded rapidly, showing a crystal-clear, high-definition view of my kitchen counters. I took a deep breath, bracing my mind and my heart for what I was about to see, and pressed play. The basement was cold, but I did not feel the chill. I sat perfectly still on the wooden stool, staring at the glowing monitor of my offline server. The grid of 16 security cameras bathed the concrete walls in a pale blue light. I reached for the mouse and pulled up the primary archive folder. I needed to see exactly what happened in the hours before I packed my bags and left for the North Georgia mountains. My hands were rough and scarred from decades of pulling heavy electrical conduit, but they were completely steady as I dragged the video timeline backward. I watched the digital clock in the corner of the screen spin in reverse. I watched the sun go down in the windows and the interior lights flick on and off. I stopped the scrubbing when the timestamp hit 11:30 at night. The house was supposed to be quiet then. Gloria had already gone upstairs to read her novel in bed, and I was in the garage double-checking my fishing gear. I enlarged the camera feed labeled Kitchen Overhead. The high-definition lens captured the entire expanse of the marble countertops, the stainless steel refrigerator, and the large island in the center of the room. The picture was crystal clear, recorded in flawless 4K resolution. For a long moment, the kitchen was completely empty. Nothing moved except the slight sway of the shadows cast by the security lights outside. Then the heavy swing door that led from the dining room slowly pushed open. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes narrowing. It was Sloane. She was fully dressed in her expensive silk pajamas, her blonde hair pulled back tightly. She moved with a strange, unnatural quietness. She did not flip on the main overhead lights. She relied entirely on the dim undercabinet lighting, casting long, distorted shadows across the marble floor. She walked straight over to the corner of the counter where Gloria kept her daily vitamins and her heart medication. She did not look around because she was absolutely certain there were no cameras in my home. She felt perfectly safe in the dark. I watched the screen, feeling my jaw clench so tight my teeth ached. Sloane reached into the deep pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a small, unlabeled amber plastic bottle. She unscrewed the child-proof cap and tapped a single large white pill onto her palm. It was not one of Gloria's usual prescriptions. It was something entirely different. Next, she opened the top drawer of the kitchen island and pulled out the heavy granite mortar and pestle that Gloria used to grind fresh spices for our Sunday dinners. She placed the white pill into the stone bowl. Then, with a chillingly calm and methodical rhythm, she began to crush it. I watched her arm move up and down, grinding the solid chemical down into a fine white powder. Her face was completely devoid of emotion. She was not panicking, she was not sweating, she was performing a calculated execution in the middle of my kitchen. Once the pill was reduced to dust, she reached for Gloria's pill organizer. She popped open the plastic compartment labeled for Tuesday morning. She carefully pulled out the clear gelatin capsule containing Gloria's daily vitamin supplement. With steady, practiced fingers, Sloane twisted the two halves of the capsule apart. She dumped the harmless vitamin powder into the sink and rinsed it down the drain. Then, using a tiny metal spoon, she scooped up the crushed white poison from the mortar and carefully funneled it right into the empty halves of my wife's pill. She snapped the capsule back together, holding it up to the dim light to inspect her work. It looked absolutely identical to the rest of the vitamins. There was no visual difference, no warning sign for my sweet, trusting wife. Sloane placed the deadly capsule right back into the Tuesday slot and snapped the plastic lid shut. She had just effectively planted a chemical bomb in the center of our lives, and she did it without a single trace of hesitation. But the true nightmare had not even finished unfolding. Just as Sloane was wiping down the granite mortar with a damp paper towel to hide the evidence, the kitchen door swung open again. Julian walked into the frame. He was wearing his gray sweatpants, looking tired and rubbing his eyes. I watched my son freeze in his tracks the moment he saw his wife standing by his mother's medication. He looked down at the paper towel in her hand, and then at the amber bottle still sitting on the counter. The high-definition camera captured the exact moment Julian realized what was happening. His eyes widened in absolute terror. He raised his hands to his mouth, nervously biting at his fingernails, a habit he had since he was a little boy whenever he knew he was in deep trouble. I waited for him to do something. I sat there in the dark basement, holding my breath, praying to God that my son would step forward. I begged the screen silently, hoping he would knock the pill organizer off the counter, grab his wife by the arm, and scream at her for what she had done. I waited for the boy I raised to be a man, to protect the mother who had given him life. But Julian did not step forward. He looked at the poison. He looked at his wife. Sloane just stared back at him, her expression cold and completely unapologetic. Julian lowered his hands. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He physically turned his back on the counter, pushed the swing door open, and walked right out of the kitchen. He left his mother to die. In that exact fraction of a second, the father inside me completely died. The warm, beating heart that had loved my son unconditionally shattered into a million pieces and was instantly replaced by solid, freezing ice. He was no longer my child. He was an accomplice to murder. I sat alone in the dim basement, the quiet hum of the server the only sound in the room. I I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. My thumb quickly dialed 911. I stared down at the bright green call button, my finger hovering just a fraction of an inch above the glass screen. All I had to do was press it. The police would be at my front door in 5 minutes. I could show them the crystal-clear video footage of Sloan tampering with the medication, and they would arrest her on the spot. But the calculating mind of a man who spent his life analyzing complex electrical grids stopped my hand. I started running the variables. If I called the local police right now, they would arrest Sloan for suspected poisoning. But her wealthy family had massive connections in the city. Her uncle was a well-known judge. They would hire a high-priced defense attorney immediately. She would post bail in less than 2 hours and walk right back out onto the street claiming the video was somehow manipulated, or that she was just crushing aspirin. Worse, Julian still held the legally binding medical proxy. While I was busy giving statements to local detectives, Julian would be completely free to march back into the intensive care unit and order the doctors to pull Gloria's life support. The local authorities could not void a medical proxy on the spot. I would lose my wife tomorrow morning, and the people who killed her might eventually beat the charges in a corrupt local courtroom. No, local police were not the answer. Calling 911 would be a massive tactical error. I needed a completely airtight, unavoidable trap that bypassed the local jurisdiction entirely. I needed federal weight. I slowly erased the 3 numbers from my phone screen. I opened my contacts list and scrolled down to a number I had not called in several years. It belonged to an old fishing buddy who just happened to be a retired federal judge. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear, ready to declare war. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat alone in my dark basement, staring at the concrete walls and running every possible scenario through my mind until the sun finally began to rise over the Georgia pines. When morning finally broke, I drove my heavy truck back out to Emory University Hospital. The crisp morning air felt thick and heavy in my lungs. I walked through the automatic sliding glass doors and made my long, slow way toward the intensive care unit. My mind was sharp and focused completely on the battle ahead. I knew exactly what I had to do to protect my wife. But when I turned the corner into the waiting area, I quickly realized that the enemy had not been sleeping either. Sloan was already there waiting for me. She was not casually drinking an iced matcha this time. She was standing tall and straight, dressed in a sharp gray designer suit, looking exactly like she was preparing for a ruthless corporate board meeting rather than a family hospital visit. Julian, my cowardly son, was nowhere to be seen, probably hiding at home from the deep shame of what he had allowed to happen to his own mother. But Sloan was certainly not alone. Standing strictly on her left was a tall man in a meticulously tailored navy suit holding a thick leather briefcase. He had the cold, dead eyes of a high-priced corporate litigator who destroyed lives for a living. Standing quietly on her right was another man wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a crisp white clinical coat holding a metal medical clipboard. They formed a solid human wall, completely blocking my path to Gloria's hospital room. I slowed my pace, letting my heavy work boots thud loudly against the sterile linoleum floor. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not show any anger. I did not show any fear. I just stopped a few feet away from them and waited for their move. Sloan casually crossed her arms over her chest. A smug, deeply satisfied smirk spread slowly across her face. She looked at me exactly like a hungry hunter looking at a trapped animal. She did not bother offering a fake polite greeting or asking how I was holding up today. She just nodded her head to the man in the navy suit. He stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase, and extended his hand, offering the heavy papers to me. I did not reach out to take the papers. I looked at the tall lawyer and asked him in a low, steady voice what kind of game they were playing now. The lawyer cleared his throat and spoke in a loud, clear voice, perfectly designed to be heard by the nurses stationed down the hall. He introduced himself as the senior litigation partner at a major downtown Atlanta law firm. He then formally introduced the man in the white coat as a private independent psychiatrist hired specifically by Sloan and Julian. The lawyer explained that they were currently filing an emergency legal petition with the county court. I asked him exactly what kind of petition they were filing. The lawyer looked me dead in the eye and said the word conservatorship. The solid floor beneath my feet felt like it was suddenly giving way. I knew exactly what a conservatorship was, and I knew the terrifying absolute legal power it carried over a person's life. The lawyer continued talking, his tone completely devoid of any human empathy or warmth. He stated that based on my recent aggressive behavior, My family was deeply concerned about my cognitive decline and my rapidly deteriorating mental health. He claimed that yesterday afternoon I had suffered a severe paranoid delusion. He told the entire hallway that I hallucinated dangerous intruders in my home and violently attacked two innocent real estate professionals who were simply doing a standard property appraisal. He claimed I was a physical danger to myself, to society, and especially to my dying wife. I shifted my gaze to Sloane. She was staring right back at me, her eyes gleaming with pure, unfiltered malice. She had taken the moment I threw her greedy vultures out of my house and masterfully twisted it into a legal weapon. She had documented my righteous anger and falsely labeled it as severe dementia. The psychiatrist chimed in, nodding his head solemnly for the audience of passing hospital staff. He said that elderly patients under severe emotional stress often experience violent psychotic breaks and lose their grip on reality. He stated very clearly that he was prepared to testify in a court of law that I was legally incompetent and entirely incapable of making any decisions for myself. They were not just trying to keep me away from Gloria anymore. They were actively trying to completely erase my legal existence. The sheer terrifying scale of their trap began to unfold clearly in my mind. If a county judge actually granted them this emergency conservatorship, they would not just hold the medical proxy for Gloria. They would gain immediate total control over my entire life and every single choice I could make. They would have the absolute legal right to force me out of my home and lock me away in a secure psychiatric ward. And while I was locked away, drugged into submission, and completely silenced, they would gain unrestricted access to every single financial asset I owned. They would quickly find the hidden blind trusts. They would uncover the multi-million-dollar commercial real estate portfolio I had spent my entire adult life building in secret to protect our future. They would eagerly strip my bank accounts bare, sell my beautiful estate to the highest bidder, and pull the plug on my precious Gloria without anyone ever questioning their motives. I stood there in the bright, sterile hospital corridor, realizing how incredibly vulnerable I appeared to the outside world. I was a 75-year-old black man with rough, calloused hands and tired, bloodshot eyes. Society was already heavily conditioned to view someone exactly like me as helpless, uneducated, or confused. And standing right in front of me was an affluent young white woman flanked by expensive, articulate professionals ready to paint me as a senile, aggressive physical threat. The legal system was practically designed from the ground up to exploit people exactly like me. It was built to let wealthy, smiling vultures swoop in and pick the bones of the elderly clean, all hidden under the respectable disguise of legal protection and medical concern. If I raised my voice right now to call them the liars they were, the psychiatrist would immediately take notes on my aggressive, paranoid outburst. If I tried to push past them to see my wife, the lawyer would call hospital security and claim I was having a violent, manic episode. Every natural instinct I had to fight back, to roar in their smug faces and expose their terrible crimes, would only be used as permanent evidence against me in a courtroom. They had boxed me into a legal corner perfectly. They honestly thought they had backed an old tired bear into a steel trap he could never possibly escape. I looked down at the heavy stack of legal papers hovering in the air between us. I looked at the cold, calculated faces of the expensive men Sloane had hired to destroy my life. Then I looked at Sloane herself. She was practically vibrating with nervous excitement, just waiting for me to explode. She desperately wanted me to shout at her. She wanted me to ball my hands into fists and give them the final piece of physical evidence they needed to lock me away forever. But I did not shout. I remembered the long, quiet conversation I had in my basement the night before with my oldest friend, the retired federal judge. I remembered the careful, strategic trap we had laid out in the dark. I needed them to feel absolutely incredibly victorious. I needed their massive greed to completely blind their basic caution. So I closed my eyes and let my broad shoulders slump forward in defeat. I let the heavy, exhausting weight of my 75 years show completely in my posture. I allowed my rough hands to tremble just a little bit at my sides. I thought about the very real, agonizing pain of seeing Gloria attached to those breathing machines, and I let that deep, raw sorrow push real tears into the corners of my eyes. I opened my eyes and looked at Sloane with the expression of a completely broken, defeated, helpless old man. I let my voice crack and waver as I spoke to her. "You win," I sobbed quietly, letting the warm tears spill over my wrinkled cheeks. "You win, Sloane. Please just do not lock me away in a ward. Do not take my home away from me. I am tired. I am so very tired. I will give you whatever you want. Just please let me be in peace. The heavy, tense atmosphere in the hallway instantly evaporated. The lawyer slowly lowered the legal documents back to his side. The psychiatrist offered a patronizing, deeply sympathetic nod, thinking he had successfully diagnosed a broken mind. And Sloane, she simply could not contain herself. A slow, vicious, incredibly evil smile stretched completely across her face. She looked down at me with absolute disgust and pure, unchecked triumph. She had completely broken the stubborn old man. She had finally won the grand prize, or at least that is exactly what she thought. They moved away from the busy hospital hallway and instructed me to follow them into a small private conference room located just down the corridor. The room was terribly cold and smelled strongly of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. It was a bleak, depressing, windowless space, usually reserved for doctors to deliver the worst possible news to grieving families. Today, it was going to be the room where I sold my entire empire to save my world. Julian was already sitting inside the room, staring blankly at the beige wall. He did not even bother to look up when we entered. He just kept his hands folded in his lap, looking completely hollowed out, weak and pathetic. I pulled out a rigid plastic chair and sat down slowly, deliberately, letting my joints pop and creak to sell the image of a frail old man. The corporate lawyer and the private psychiatrist stood right behind Sloane like a pair of loyal, heavily paid bodyguards ready to strike. Sloane took the seat directly across the table from me, crossing her arms over her chest. She tapped her foot impatiently and told me to make it quick because she had important things to do today. I took a slow, shaking breath and looked her straight in the cold blue eyes. I told her I would not fight the conservatorship petition in court. I told her I would give her exactly what she had always really wanted from me. I told her I was prepared to legally surrender the absolute deed to the 50-acre commercial property located right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. I promised to transfer it directly and permanently into her personal real estate limited liability company. No questions asked, no long drawn-out legal battles, no interference from my accountants or lawyers. It would be hers completely free and clear by the end of the day. In exchange, Julian had to immediately sign the medical power of attorney proxy back over to me, and they had to drop the conservatorship petition right this very second so I could go back to my wife. The room went completely deathly silent. The lawyer shifted his weight in pure surprise. Julian finally looked up from the table, his eyes wide with absolute shock. Sloane actually stopped breathing for a few long seconds. Her arrogant, combative posture completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, stunned disbelief. That specific piece of land was not just a random plot of dirt. It was my most secretive and by far my most valuable financial asset. For the last 5 years, Sloane had been aggressively trying to convince me to sell it to her brokerage. She read the city planning documents and knew the city council had recently rezoned that exact area for a massive, high-density, mixed-use commercial development. We are talking about luxury apartment complexes, high-end retail shopping space, and towering corporate glass offices. In the hands of the right ambitious developer, that raw land was worth easily over $100 million. Sloane had intensely lusted after that property since the very first day she found out I quietly owned it. She used to constantly drop passive-aggressive hints at our family Thanksgiving dinners, telling me I was sitting on a massive gold mine and wasting its potential. She always simply assumed I was just a tired, stubborn old black man who was way too lazy and far too foolish to develop it himself. She thought I was throwing away a massive generational opportunity because I lacked the basic intelligence and the sophisticated connections to navigate the ruthless corporate real estate world. She had absolutely no idea that I kept that land completely vacant on purpose for very specific reasons she would soon discover in the worst way possible. To her, it was the ultimate grand prize. It was the absolute peak of her wild, greedy ambitions. To have that deed transferred directly into her own company name meant she would finally bypass my son entirely. She would not have to sit around and wait for me to die to get her huge payout. She would instantly become a major, powerful player in the elite Atlanta real estate market. She would finally have the massive wealth, the luxury cars, and the high society status she had always desperately craved, and she would have it all before dinner time today. I watched her face transform completely before my eyes. The sheer, unfiltered, sickening greed washed over her sharp features like a massive tidal wave breaking over a wall. Her breathing became incredibly shallow and fast. Her eyes widened so much I could clearly see the white all the way around her pupils. She leaned forward, placing both of her hands flat on the table, her long acrylic nails tapping frantically against the fake wood grain of the conference table. She looked over her shoulder at her expensive corporate lawyer and then looked right back at me. She told me I had a deal. But then the deep, suspicious nature of a true-born parasite kicked in. She narrowed her eyes and pointed a shaking finger right at my face. She said she was absolutely not going to sign any standard downloaded legal forms I might have brought with me. She said she knew I was a sneaky, manipulative old man, and she was not going to let me trick her out of this incredible fortune. She aggressively demanded that her own highly paid lawyer draft every single page of the transfer paperwork right there in the hospital conference room. She wanted her legal team to heavily scrutinize every single word to guarantee the absolute permanent transfer of the massive asset. She wanted to ensure there were absolutely no hidden loopholes, no sneaky takebacks, and no secret clauses that could possibly ruin her massive payday. She wanted the deed locked down tight so I could never challenge it in court. I looked at her with a tired, thoroughly broken expression and nodded my heavy head. I told her that was perfectly fine with me. I told her I did not care who wrote the paperwork as long as I got the legal right to save my dying wife. The lawyer immediately stepped forward, pulled a sleek silver laptop from his expensive leather briefcase and began typing furiously. The sharp clicking sound of his fingers hitting the keyboard echoed loudly in the small, confined room, filling the tense silence. As the lawyer typed rapidly, creating the documents that would seal her fate, Sloane leaned back in her plastic chair. Her extreme arrogance and overwhelming confidence were completely restored. She felt like a brilliant conqueror dictating harsh terms to a totally defeated, helpless enemy. She looked over at Julian, who was still staring miserably at the floor, and then she looked right back at me with a truly sickening, evil smile. She raised her hand and told her lawyer to stop typing for a moment. She said she wanted to add one final non-negotiable condition to the contract. She wanted a full, total indemnity clause. She looked me right in the eyes with absolute chilling coldness and said she wanted it clearly in writing that neither she nor Julian could ever be sued by me for any accidental medical mix-ups regarding Gloria prior to today. She said she wanted total legal immunity from any future civil lawsuits just in case Gloria's sudden health issues were somehow traced back to a random mistake made at home with her daily vitamins. She was actively trying to secure her absolute total freedom from the terrible poison she had intentionally fed my wife. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was demanding a written confession of her own crime disguised as legal protection. I knew I had to sell my reaction perfectly to close the trap. I jumped up out of my chair, knocking it violently backward onto the hard floor. I slammed both of my fists hard onto the table and yelled right in her face. I asked her how she could even suggest such a disgusting, terrible thing while my beautiful wife was currently dying just down the hall. I put on the absolute performance of my life, pretending to be deeply outraged and entirely out of options. Sloane just laughed a cold, heartless, completely empty sound. She told me those were the final terms and I could either take them right now or go sit down and watch my wife die. I stood there breathing heavily, letting my fists shake with fake fury. I closed my eyes, lowered my head, and gave a slow, defeated, helpless nod. The heavy silence in the hospital conference room was only broken by the sharp and rapid clicking of the corporate lawyer's keyboard and the loud, relentless ticking of the analog clock on the beige wall. Every single click and every single tick felt like a physical hammer striking against my chest. Time was the one resource I did not have in abundance. According to the grim ultimatum delivered by the intensive care doctor, my sweet Gloria had barely 8 hours left before her internal organs would begin to fail completely and irreversibly. 8 short hours before the poison Sloane had ground up in my kitchen would finish its terrible work. But I could not show my rising panic. I had to remain seated in that rigid plastic chair, playing the role of the broken and desperate old man, while the lawyer meticulously crafted the instrument of their destruction. The tall man in the navy suit was taking his absolute sweet time, carefully scrutinizing every single paragraph and legal definition in the property deed transfer. He wanted to make absolutely certain that the 50 acres of prime downtown Atlanta real estate would go directly and permanently into Sloane's newly formed personal limited liability company. He was aggressively typing out specific clauses to ensure that I could never challenge the transfer in a civil court once the ink was dry. He loudly read the terms to Sloane, emphasizing that the property was being legally transferred under a strict as-is condition. He explained to her that an as-is clause meant she was accepting the massive plot of commercial land in its exact current state, with absolutely no warranties, no guarantees, and no possibility of returning it to me if she found something she did not like. He asked her if she understood and accepted those incredibly strict terms. Sloane nodded her head vigorously, her eyes wide and shining with an ugly, ravenous greed. She practically salivated at the words "as is," because she assumed it meant I was just too tired and too financially uneducated to clean up the lot before handing it over. She thought the worst thing she might have to deal with was a few overgrown weeds or some old concrete foundations from previous decades. She eagerly agreed to the harsh transfer conditions, completely blind to the fact that her expensive corporate lawyer was actively wrapping a massive legal chain around her neck and handing me the lock. She just sat there drumming her long acrylic nails against the table, smiling at Julian as if they had just won the largest lottery jackpot in human history. After what felt like an eternity, the lawyer finally hit the print button. A thick stack of crisp white legal documents slid out of the portable printer he had brought in his heavy leather briefcase. He organized the papers into two neat piles on the conference table. Then he stepped out into the hospital hallway and returned a few moments later with a licensed hospital notary public. She was a quiet older woman in scrubs who simply asked for our state identification cards and placed her official ink stamp heavily on the table. The moment of absolute truth had finally arrived. The lawyer slid the first document across the table toward my son. It was the medical power of attorney, the single piece of paper that held the absolute power of life and death over my wife. Julian picked up the black ink pen. I watched his face closely, desperately hoping to see even a tiny flicker of hesitation or a sudden rush of moral guilt. I prayed to a silent God that the boy I raised would look at that paper, remember the mother who loved him unconditionally, and throw the pen across the room. But Julian did not hesitate. He did not look at me, and he did not look at the notary. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the table and signed his name with a quick, fluid motion. He completely legally surrendered his authority. The notary pulled the paper toward her, signed her own name, and pressed her heavy metal stamp down onto the page. A loud, solid thud echoed in the small room. In that exact fraction of a second, Julian officially lost the legal power to kill his mother. The invisible ticking clock hanging over Gloria's hospital bed suddenly stopped. Then the lawyer slid the second massive stack of documents across the table toward me. It was the absolute deed to the 50-acre commercial property, the supposed crown jewel of my hidden financial empire. I reached out and took the pen. I forced my hand to tremble slightly, making the tip of the pen shake as it hovered over the signature line. I let out a long, weak sigh, pretending that signing this paper was the most agonizing financial defeat of my entire 75 years on this earth. I slowly traced my name onto the thick paper, transferring a property they believed to be worth over $100 million directly to the woman who had poisoned my wife. I signed the main page and then initialed the strict as-is assumption of liability clauses on the following pages. When I finished, I slid the thick stack back across the table. The notary reviewed my signatures, nodded her head, and brought her heavy stamp down on the final page. The loud thud echoed a second time. The deal was officially and irrevocably done. The trap was permanently sealed. Before the notary even had a chance to pack up her supplies and leave the room, Sloane lunged forward. She literally snatched the thick property deed off the conference table, clutching the legal documents tightly against the chest of her expensive designer suit. She held the papers like a starving animal protecting a fresh kill. Her entire demeanor shifted instantly. The slight mask of professional negotiation completely vanished, replaced by a dark, cruel, and deeply arrogant Victor. She stood up from her chair, looking down her narrow nose at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. She let out a dry, mocking laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. She told me I was a foolish, pathetic old man who had held onto the past for far too long. She said I could finally take my little medical paper and go back to the intensive care unit. She told me to sit in that uncomfortable hospital chair and enjoy watching my wife flatline because there was absolutely nothing the doctors could do to save her now. Her voice was pure venom, dripping with the terrible confidence of someone who truly believed they had committed the perfect crime. She smoothed down the front of her suit and announced that she would unfortunately not be able to attend Gloria's upcoming funeral. She looked me dead in the eyes and said she would simply be far too busy meeting with elite city architects and structural engineers to plan the layout of her brand new luxury high-rise development. I did not respond to her cruel taunts. I simply turned my head and looked at Julian. My son was still sitting in his plastic chair, refusing to stand up and refusing to make any eye contact with me. He had just traded his own mother's life for a piece of commercial real estate and a chance to escape his massive financial debts. He looked completely hollowed out, emasculated, and morally bankrupt. He was a small, terrified shadow of a man hiding behind the vicious ambition of his greedy wife. Staring at his bowed head, I finally accepted the terrible reality. There was absolutely nothing left to save in my son. The boy I had loved and protected was gone forever, replaced by a cowardly accomplice to murder. I reached out and slowly picked up the medical power of attorney from the table. I folded the crisp paper very carefully, making sure the creases were perfectly straight. I unbuttoned my jacket and tucked the document safely into my inside breast pocket, pressing it firmly over my heart. I had secured the only thing that actually mattered in this world. My wife was safe from their hands. The physical transformation was immediate and absolute. The fake trembling in my rough hands completely vanished. The forced tears that had pooled in the corners of my eyes dried up in an instant. The heavy, defeated slump in my shoulders disappeared as I straightened my spine. I stood up from the rigid plastic chair, rising to my full, imposing height. I rolled my shoulders back, shedding the carefully crafted illusion of the frail, senile old man like a heavy winter coat. I stood there projecting the quiet, commanding, and dangerous presence of a man who had spent 4 decades building a massive empire in a ruthless industry. The sudden dramatic shift in my posture sent a highly visible shockwave across the room. The corporate lawyer took a nervous half-step backward, his hand gripping his leather briefcase a little tighter. The private psychiatrist suddenly looked incredibly uncomfortable, adjusting his glasses and looking toward the door. Sloane's mocking laugh died instantly in her throat. The smug, arrogant smile melted off her face, replaced by a sudden flash of deep, primal uncertainty. She clutched the heavy property deed a little tighter to her chest, suddenly realizing that the old man standing in front of her was not the broken victim she thought she had conquered. I turned away from the table and walked slowly toward the door, my heavy work boots making solid, confident sounds on the floor. I placed my hand on the metal doorknob. I did not yell. I did not curse at them or threaten them with physical violence. I simply stopped, turned my head slightly, and looked back at Sloane over my shoulder. My voice was completely cold, perfectly calm, and carried the devastating weight of an absolute checkmate. I told her that before she called her elite city architects, she should probably sit down and read the Environmental Protection Agency addendum located on page 42 of that deed. Sloane let out a loud, obnoxious scoff, waving her manicured hand in the air as if she was batting away a pesky, annoying fly. She told me I was just a bitter old man trying to ruin her glorious moment of triumph with completely meaningless legal threats. She confidently stated that there was absolutely nothing on page 42 or any other page in that thick packet that could possibly take away the massive financial victory she had just aggressively secured. But the expensive corporate lawyer standing right behind her did not share her reckless, arrogant confidence. He was a man who truly understood the intricate and often deadly traps hidden deep inside commercial real estate law. He placed his sleek silver laptop down on the table and quickly reached for the thick stack of signed documents. His fingers moved frantically as he flipped past the signature lines, past the standard municipal zoning agreements, and past the physical property boundaries, until he finally reached the environmental addendum section at the very back of the packet. He found page 42. The room went completely deathly quiet. I stood by the door with my shoulders pulled back and watched the dramatic physical transformation of a man who suddenly realized he had just completely destroyed his own client. The color completely drained from his face in a matter of seconds, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His eyes darted rapidly back and forth across the densely typed paragraphs, reading the exact same terrifying lines over and over again. Then his hands began to shake. It was not just a small nervous twitch. His fingers were trembling so violently that the thick, crisp legal paper rattled loudly in the silent room. Sloane looked up at him, her confident, vicious smile faltering for the very first time. She asked him what was wrong, expecting him to reassure her that the old man was just talking crazy nonsense. But the lawyer did not answer her. He just kept staring at the paper, his mouth hanging slightly open as the absolute magnitude of the fatal error crashed down on his shoulders. He had been so intensely focused on securing the asset and locking me out of the deal that he completely failed to investigate the actual physical nature of the property itself. Sloane aggressively snatched the papers out of his trembling hands and started reading the page herself. She squinted at the complex legal jargon, her eyes quickly scanning the heavy paragraphs. She mumbled the words aloud, trying to comprehend what she was actually looking at. Environmental Protection Agency designated Superfund site. She looked up at me, her face twisted in deep confusion and sudden rising panic. She demanded to know what a Superfund site was and why it was officially attached to her brand-new multi-million-dollar downtown development lot. I looked at her with a calm, steady gaze and finally told her the absolute devastating truth. I explained that the 50-acre lot sitting right in the heart of the city was not a hidden gold mine waiting to be developed into luxury high-rises and expensive retail shops. It was completely and utterly worthless. Back in the 1970s, long before the city expanded and the area became desirable, that specific plot of land was used as an illegal industrial dumping ground by a massive chemical manufacturing company. The soil and the groundwater deep beneath the surface were heavily contaminated with highly toxic heavy metals and deadly industrial solvents. The federal government had eventually stepped in, fenced off the entire area, and permanently designated it as a severely hazardous Superfund site. I told her that decades ago, when the original owners went completely bankrupt trying to flee the massive government fines, I had quietly purchased the abandoned deed through an anonymous shell company for absolute pennies on the dollar. I kept it completely dormant, paying the minimal property taxes every single year, just waiting for the day I might actually need a financial weapon of mass destruction. I knew the city zoning board had recently rezoned the surrounding area, hoping some foolish, wealthy investor would eventually come along and clean it up. But the land itself was completely unbuildable. You could not pour a single yard of concrete or lay a single brick foundation until the federal government was completely satisfied that every single ounce of toxic dirt was permanently removed and safely destroyed. Sloane staggered backward as if she had been physically struck in the chest with a heavy iron bar. She dropped the heavy deed onto the table, shaking her head in violent denial. She looked at her lawyer and screamed at him to fix it, to tear up the contract or go to a judge and claim it was signed under extreme emotional duress. She yelled that she had been tricked and that the entire contract was completely invalid. But the lawyer slowly shook his head, his voice barely more than a terrified whisper. He told her she had not been tricked at all. He quietly reminded her that she was the one who had aggressively demanded her own legal team draft the final paperwork to keep me away from it. She was the one who insisted that the property be transferred directly and completely into her own personal limited liability company. And most importantly, she was the one who had arrogantly demanded the strict as-is and full assumption of liability clauses to prevent me from ever taking the land back. By legally forcing those specific absolute conditions onto the transfer, she did not just take ownership of the contaminated dirt. She legally and permanently adopted every single financial burden attached to that land. I stepped away from the door and walked slowly back toward the table, letting my words sink deep into her greedy soul. I told her that the Environmental Protection Agency had recently issued a mandatory federal cleanup order for that specific property. The estimated cost to excavate the toxic soil, purify the groundwater, and satisfy the strict federal safety regulations was astronomical. I looked right into her panicked wide eyes and gave her the exact number, $8 million. That was the mandatory federal debt she had just eagerly signed her name to. By using her own lawyer to lock me out of the deal, she had completely bypassed my corporate shell company protections and linked her own personal and professional identity directly to the federal government. She had just voluntarily swallowed an $8 million poison pill, and she had practically begged me to let her do it. The absolute reality of her complete financial destruction finally broke through her thick wall of arrogance. Sloane let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed violently off the walls of the hospital conference room. She grabbed the edges of her expensive blonde hair, pulling at the roots as she began to hyperventilate. She looked wildly at Julian, who was sitting completely frozen in his chair, his jaw dropped in sheer absolute horror. Sloane screamed at the top of her lungs that she would just declare total bankruptcy. She yelled that her real estate company would simply fold and she would walk away clean, leaving the government to deal with the toxic dirt. She turned to her lawyer, desperately seeking confirmation that she could just wipe the massive federal debt away and start over. But the lawyer did not offer her any comfort. He slowly packed his silver laptop into his expensive leather briefcase, refusing to make eye contact with her ever again. He leaned in close and whispered the devastating, undeniable truth that sealed her fate. He told her she could not bankrupt her way out of federal environmental liabilities. The government does not forgive or erase Superfund cleanup debts for anyone. He explained that because she used her primary real estate brokerage to receive the deed, the Environmental Protection Agency would immediately pierce her corporate veil and come directly after her personal wealth. The government would not wait for a long, drawn-out civil court battle. By this coming Friday, federal agents would aggressively seize every single bank account she owned. They would place massive federal liens on her luxury cars and her beautiful suburban home. They would permanently strip away her state brokerage license, completely destroying her entire career in a matter of days. She would be left with absolutely nothing but a mountain of federal debt she could never possibly repay in 100 lifetimes. Sloane completely lost whatever was left of her mind. She lunged forward over the beige conference table and grabbed the thick stack of signed legal documents. Her face was flushed a deep, angry red, and she let out a guttural sound that was halfway between a scream and a growl. She dug her sharp acrylic nails into the heavy paper and pulled with all her might, trying to physically rip the contract into pieces. She actually thought that destroying the physical paper would magically erase the $8 million federal debt she had just eagerly accepted. Her expensive corporate lawyer quickly backed away from the table, holding his leather briefcase tightly to his chest, wanting absolutely nothing to do with her violent outburst. She managed to tear the top page straight down the middle, but before she could destroy the rest, the heavy wooden door to the conference room pushed open. My oldest friend walked into the room wearing a sharp charcoal suit. He was a retired federal judge and a man who commanded absolute respect just by walking into a space. He did not look surprised by Sloane's frantic behavior. He held a sleek silver tablet in his hand and looked at her with a calm, steady gaze. He told her to go ahead and tear up the physical papers if it made her feel any better. He explained in a smooth, authoritative voice that the physical destruction of the document was completely meaningless now. He told her that his paralegal had been standing by in the hallway the entire time. The exact moment the notary stamped the final page, the documents were digitally scanned and electronically filed directly with the county clerk office and the Federal Environmental Protection Agency database. He looked right into her panicked eyes and told her the transfer was completely legally binding and absolutely irreversible. The massive debt was officially hers. Sloane froze her hands, still clutching the torn pages. The realization that she was permanently trapped hit her like a massive freight train. She dropped the ripped papers onto the table and began to violently hyperventilate. While Sloane was struggling to catch her breath, my son Julian finally comprehended the massive scale of the disaster. He had been sitting frozen in his plastic chair, but the words $8 million federal debt finally penetrated his thick skull. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that because they were legally married, her massive unpayable debt was now his permanent problem too. The luxury cars, the beautiful suburban home, the expensive country club memberships, and his entire respectable career at the downtown bank were all going to be aggressively seized by the federal government. His comfortable, privileged life was officially over forever. Julian stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the hard floor. He turned to face his wife, his face completely twisted with panic and pure unadulterated rage. He pointed a shaking finger at her and screamed that this was all her fault. He yelled that her endless, disgusting greed had completely ruined their lives. He shouted that he only agreed to go along with this terrible plan because she promised him they would walk away with $100 million. He called her a foolish, arrogant woman who thought she was smarter than everyone else but was actually just a blind, greedy amateur. He stood there screaming right in her face, blaming her for the exact same crime he had willingly participated in. Sloane did not back down. She was cornered and desperate, and she reacted exactly like a venomous snake. She raised her hand and slapped Julian directly across the face with all her strength. The sharp, cracking sound of her palm striking his cheek echoed violently in the small enclosed room. Julian's head snapped to the side. He stumbled backward, holding his bright red cheek, looking at her with absolute shock. Sloane screamed right back at him, calling him a weak, pathetic coward. She yelled that he was a useless man who never could have provided the luxury lifestyle she deserved without her pushing him to take what was rightfully theirs. She blamed his weak nerves and told him to shut his mouth and figure out a way to get them out of this mess. They stood there in the middle of the hospital conference room, viciously tearing each other apart. The so-called perfect wealthy couple was completely disintegrating right in front of my eyes, destroyed by the very greed they tried to use against me. I stood near the door with my retired federal judge friend, quietly watching the brutal civil war unfold. I watched the son I had raised and the daughter-in-law I had tolerated viciously attack one another. A younger, softer version of myself might have stepped in to break up the fight. A foolish father might have felt a shred of pity for his child. But I felt absolutely nothing but cold, hard justice. I let them scream. I let them point fingers and hurl terrible insults at each other until their voices grew hoarse and they began to run out of breath. Their lungs were burning and their chests were heaving. They were completely exhausted by their own toxic panic. I waited until there was a slight pause in their screaming. Then I took exactly 2 steps forward. The heavy thud of my boots on the floor immediately drew their attention. I looked at the two of them, my face completely blank, my posture perfectly straight. My voice cut through the remaining tension in the room like a razor-sharp knife. I told them they were arguing over absolutely nothing. I said the $8 million federal debt, the lost luxury cars, and the ruined credit scores were just the very beginning of their problems. I watched their eyes widen in renewed terror as they realized I was not finished with them. I spoke slowly, enunciating every single word so they would understand the absolute gravity of their situation. I said, "That is just the money. Money can be lost, and money can be seized. But what we are going to discuss next cannot be fixed by a bankruptcy court. Now let us talk about the attempted murder." The entire room went completely dead quiet. The air was sucked entirely out of the space. Sloane's mouth dropped open. Julian stopped rubbing his stinging cheek and stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Even Sloane's corporate lawyer, who had been trying to silently sneak out of the room, froze with his hand resting on the brass doorknob. No one dared to breathe. They thought their biggest problem was an environmental protection agency lien. They had completely forgotten about the terrible crime they had committed the night before in the dark corners of my kitchen. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought the old man was completely blind to their true evil. I walked slowly back toward the conference table. I reached into the front pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small black flash drive. I placed it gently onto the beige table directly next to the torn pages of the property deed. It made a soft clicking sound against the fake wood grain. I asked my retired judge friend to hand me his silver tablet. I plugged the small black drive into the side port of the device. I looked up at Sloane, who was now trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the table just to stay standing. I explained to her that she had made a massive, fatal mistake, assuming I was just a tired old man who did not understand modern technology. I told her about my decades of experience wiring high-security commercial buildings. I told her about the closed-circuit analog security network I had personally built into the walls and air vents of my own home. I watched the blood completely drain from her face as I explained that my house was never blind and that it saw absolutely everything she did. I tapped the screen of the tablet, opening the secure video file. I turned the bright screen around so it was facing directly at Sloane and Julian. I hit the play button and stepped back. The high-definition 4K video filled the screen. It showed the dim lighting of my kitchen. It showed Sloane walking into the frame in her silk pajamas. The video was crystal clear. There was no denying who it was, and there was no denying what she was doing. They watched in absolute horrified silence as the digital version of Sloane crushed the toxic white pill in my wife's stone mortar. They watched her carefully funnel the deadly powder into Gloria's daily vitamin capsules. And then Julian saw himself walk into the frame. He watched himself discover the poison panic and then cowardly walk away, leaving his mother to be murdered. The reality of the undeniable video evidence hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Julian let out a loud, agonizing wail. His legs completely gave out beneath him, and he dropped heavily to his knees right there on the hard hospital floor. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Sloane just stared at the screen, her eyes completely vacant, trapped in a nightmare she could never wake up from. Sloane backed away from the laptop screen as if the glowing digital image of her own face was going to reach out and physically burn her. Her chest heaved up and down in rapid, erratic jerks as she began to violently hyperventilate. The absolute reality of seeing her terrible midnight crime broadcasted in crystal-clear definition completely broke her fragile, arrogant mind. She stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the conference table, and frantically grabbed the thick stack of signed legal documents. She held the torn papers up like a physical shield, desperately searching for the specific page she had demanded her lawyer add just moments ago. Her trembling fingers finally found the indemnity clause. She pointed a long, shaking acrylic nail at the black ink and screamed at the top of her lungs. She yelled that I could not use the video against her. She shouted that I had legally signed away my right to sue her for any accidental health issues regarding Gloria. She was completely trapped in her own delusional reality, truly believing that a simple paragraph drafted by a corporate real estate lawyer could magically erase a recorded murder attempt. She kept repeating the words accidental medical mix-up over and over again, trying to convince the room that funneling toxic powder into a vitamin capsule was just a harmless, innocent mistake. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes and declared that she had total legal immunity. She honestly thought that her clever little contract was a bulletproof vest that would protect her from the massive consequences of her own evil actions. She stood there, gripping the paper so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white, demanding that we delete the video immediately because she was protected by the law. She looked over at Julian, expecting her husband to stand up and defend her legal brilliant strategy, but Julian remained on his knees, quietly sobbing into his hands. Sloane was entirely alone, standing on an island of her own arrogant delusion and refusing to accept that her massive grand plan had completely collapsed. My oldest friend, the retired federal judge, stepped forward from the corner of the room. He did not look angry or upset. He looked completely relaxed and carried a chillingly calm smile on his weathered face. He placed his hands in his pockets and looked down at Sloane with the kind of deep pity reserved for a truly foolish child. He spoke in a smooth, authoritative voice that instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. He told Sloane that she clearly did not understand the basic difference between civil litigation and criminal prosecution. He explained that her clever little indemnity clause absolutely protected her from one very specific thing. It protected her from me filing a civil lawsuit to collect monetary damages for an accidental injury. He slowly leaned forward and looked directly into her panicked, wide eyes, letting his words sink deep into her brain. He told her that a private contract between two regular citizens cannot ever override state or federal criminal law. He explained that no piece of paper on earth gives anyone the legal right to intentionally poison another human being. The judge smiled a cold, terrifying smile and delivered the absolute checkmate. He told her that her special indemnity clause did not protect her from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In fact, he explained quietly her aggressive insistence on adding that specific clause to the deed transfer actually served as a fully documented written confession. She had forced her own lawyer to document her deep, guilty conscience on the official record before anyone had even accused her of doing anything wrong. The absolute brilliance of the trap finally clicked in her mind. She had completely outsmarted herself. By trying to build a legal wall to hide behind, she had actually handed us the exact legal rope we needed to hang her. The paper she was clutching to her chest was not a shield anymore. It was her signed permanent ticket to a federal prison cell. Her expensive corporate lawyer refused to make eye contact with her because he knew the retired judge was absolutely correct. I walked over to the table and closed the laptop screen. The sudden silence in the room was incredibly heavy and deafening. I looked at Sloane and told her I did not just stop at watching the video footage. I explained that a man who spends 40 years designing complex digital electrical networks knows exactly how to track a hidden digital footprint. I told her that I paused the high-definition video and zoomed in perfectly on the small amber pill bottle she had left sitting on my kitchen counter. I read the faint tracking numbers printed on the side of the pharmacy label. I explained that I tapped into her unprotected home internet network while she was busy taking inventory of my antique furniture earlier that afternoon. I found all of her deleted internet browsing history and her hidden digital transaction receipts. She was so incredibly arrogant and sloppy. I told her that she did not even bother to use cash or a prepaid anonymous card to buy the poison. She actually used her primary real estate brokerage corporate bank account to illegally purchase black market potassium chloride from a shady offshore online pharmacy. I watched the remaining color drain completely out of her face as I named the exact chemical she used. Potassium chloride is a deadly substance that causes massive internal organ failure and a sudden, massive heart attack, which is exactly what she wanted the doctors to believe happened to my sweet wife. I explained that she was so incredibly foolish that she had the deadly chemical shipped directly to her real estate office using the United States Postal Service. She used the federal mail system and a federally insured corporate banking account to facilitate the violent murder of an elderly woman. She truly believed she was committing the perfect untraceable crime because potassium chloride naturally dissipates in the blood and is incredibly hard for local medical examiners to find unless they know exactly what they are looking for. But she left a massive financial and digital trail that any federal investigator could follow in their sleep. I stood tall and delivered the final devastating blow to the woman who tried to end my world. I explained that her sloppy, arrogant actions triggered a massive avalanche of severe federal crimes. By using her business computer and corporate internet connection to buy the poison, she committed federal wire fraud. By having the deadly potassium chloride delivered across state lines using the government mail system, she committed federal mail fraud. And by physically bringing that federal contraband into my home and placing it directly into my wife's daily medication capsules, she committed the crime of attempted murder. I told her that she was no longer dealing with a simple local police department that her wealthy, connected family could easily bribe or manipulate. She had dragged the absolute full weight of the entire federal government directly into her greedy little real estate scheme. Just as I finished speaking, the heavy wooden doors of the hospital conference room burst open. The sudden loud crash made everyone jump in shock. Two large men wearing dark suits and tactical vests with the letters FBI printed in bright yellow across their chests walked rapidly into the room. Right behind them walked a stern-looking woman wearing a silver badge identifying her as a senior investigator for the Environmental Protection Agency. They stepped inside and completely blocked the only exit. The trap was fully sprung and there was absolutely nowhere left for her to run. The two federal agents stood completely still, filling the doorway with their massive frames. The bright yellow letters on their tactical vests seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital conference room. The senior agent spoke, his voice a deep rumbling baritone that left absolutely no room for argument or negotiation. He announced that they were executing federal arrest warrants for Sloan Reed and Julian Reed. The words hung in the stale air, heavy and undeniable. Sloan backed away slowly, her expensive leather heels scraping awkwardly against the cheap linoleum floor. She hit the beige wall behind her and pressed her back against it, looking exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. Her chesty heaved and her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for any possible exit. She looked over at her expensive corporate real estate lawyer, the man she had paid thousands of dollars to secure her glorious future. She ordered him to do something. She demanded that he file an injunction, or call a judge, or make the federal agents leave the hospital immediately. But the tall man in the navy suit did not say a single word to defend her. He was a corporate litigator who drafted property deeds and negotiated zoning permits. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with federal wire fraud and the attempted murder of an elderly woman. He calmly reached across the table and closed his silver laptop, sliding it smoothly into his premium leather briefcase. He gathered his expensive pens and zipped the bag shut. Sloan screamed at him again, her voice cracking with pure desperation, but he simply adjusted his silk tie, kept his eyes completely lowered, and walked straight past the federal agents out into the hospital hallway. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind him, sealing her completely inside her nightmare. While Sloan was pressed against the wall, hyperventilating, Julian was still kneeling on the floor. The devastating reality of the federal warrants finally shattered whatever fragile delusion he had left. The comfortable, wealthy life he had built entirely on a foundation of lies and debt was burning to ashes right in front of his eyes. He looked up at the federal agents and then he looked at me. The sheer terror in his eyes was pathetic. He did not stand up and face his consequences like a man. Instead, he dropped his hands to the floor and literally began to crawl across the room toward me. He dragged his knees across the dirty floor, ruining his tailored suit pants, leaving dark scuff marks behind him. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the fabric of my pant leg, clutching it with a desperate, crushing grip. He buried his face against my knee, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably. The sound of his crying was wet and pathetic, echoing miserably in the small room. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice muffled by the thick fabric of my trousers. "You have to believe me." I did not know what she was doing. I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea. He tilted his head up, his face covered in tears and snot, completely stripped of his usual arrogant country club pride. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, spinning a desperate web of miserable lies. He claimed he just walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. He swore he thought his wife was just crushing aspirin for a headache. He begged me to tell the federal agents that it was all a big misunderstanding. He pleaded with me to use my hidden millions to hire the best defense attorneys in the country to save him from going to a federal penitentiary. He cried that he was my only child and that I could not just stand there and let them take him away in chains. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping creature clinging to my leg. I felt absolutely no warmth in my chest. I felt no protective fatherly instinct urging me to reach down and comfort him. The deep well of love I had carried for him my entire life had completely dried up, leaving nothing but cold, hard stone. I stared at his tear-stained face and remembered the crystal-clear 4K video footage playing on the monitor in my dark basement. I spoke to him in a voice so incredibly quiet and devoid of emotion that it made the federal agents pause and listen. I told him he was a terrible liar. I told him that I watched the video frame by frame. I reminded him that he looked directly at the heavy stone mortar and pestle. He looked directly at the unfamiliar amber pill bottle sitting on the marble counter. I told him that I saw the exact moment the terrible truth registered in his eyes. He knew exactly what his wife was funneling into the daily vitamin capsules of his mother. And instead of rushing forward to knock the poison into the sink, he chose to protect his own selfish lifestyle. He chose his luxury cars and his expensive house over the life of the woman who gave birth to him. I looked deep into his terrified eyes and delivered my final judgment. You watched her mix the poison, Julian. You looked right at it, and you walked away. I let those words sink into his brain, destroying his pathetic excuses. Then I told him the absolute hardest truth a father could ever speak. You are not my son. You are just an accomplice. He gasped as if I had driven a knife directly into his chest. He tightened his grip on my pant leg, sobbing harder and begging me to take it back. But I was completely finished with him. I shifted my weight, planted my left foot firmly on the floor, and violently kicked my right leg free. The sudden, forceful motion ripped the fabric right out of his sweaty hands, sending him tumbling backward onto the floor. I stepped away from him physically and emotionally, severing the bloodline forever. The loud scuffle of Julian falling backward drew the attention of Sloane. She looked at her pathetic, weeping husband on the floor, and then looked at the federal agents moving slowly toward her. The sheer panic completely overtook her rational mind. She pushed herself off the wall and tried to dart toward the corner of the room, looking for any possible way to escape the inevitable. But the female federal investigator from the Environmental Protection Agency was incredibly fast and completely unforgiving. She lunged forward, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. She grabbed Sloane aggressively by the shoulder of her expensive designer jacket, spinning her around with brutal force. Sloane let out a sharp cry of pain and shock, but the agent did not slow down or show any mercy. She slammed Sloane forward, pressing her chest and face incredibly hard against the beige conference table. The violent impact sent the torn pieces of the fraudulent property deed scattering through the air and fluttering uselessly to the floor. Sloane struggled, kicking her expensive leather heels and screaming that they were making a massive mistake. She demanded that they let her go immediately, claiming she was a respected business owner and a prominent member of the community. The female agent completely ignored her frantic, entitled screaming. She reached to her duty belt and pulled out a pair of heavy, cold steel handcuffs. She grabbed the right wrist of the struggling woman, twisting it painfully behind her back, and clamped the metal bracelet down tight. The sharp metallic click echoed through the room like a final definitive punctuation mark. She grabbed the left wrist and locked it into place, securing the wealthy, arrogant real estate broker like a common, violent street criminal. The agent leaned over the trembling shoulder of her prisoner, her voice hard and completely professional. "Sloane Reed," she announced clearly over the sound of the sobbing, "you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I stood quietly in the corner of the room, watching the cold, heavy steel bite into her manicured wrists, finally delivering the absolute justice my wife so deeply deserved. The metallic click of the heavy, cold steel handcuffs echoing in the small hospital conference room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire 75 years of life. The female federal investigator from the Environmental Protection Agency did not handle Sloane with any of the gentle respect or careful, delicate treatment that Sloane truly believed she was naturally entitled to. The federal agent yanked her up from the beige conference table, pulling her arms tightly and forcefully behind her back. Sloane stumbled heavily, her expensive imported leather heels slipping awkwardly on the cheap linoleum floor. As she was violently pulled upright, the long leather strap of her incredibly expensive designer handbag caught on the sharp plastic arm of the rigid conference chair. The sudden, aggressive jerking motion ripped the bag directly from her shoulder. It hit the hard floor completely upside down, spilling its precious contents everywhere across the room. Her expensive designer makeup, her shiny luxury car keys, and a thick, heavy stack of shiny platinum credit cards scattered wildly across the floor tiles. Those were the exact same premium credit cards I had completely frozen and canceled just a few short hours earlier. They slid across the floor, becoming completely useless pieces of colorful plastic that could not buy her a single second of freedom or comfort. The tall male agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation slowly walked over to Julian, who was still kneeling helplessly on the floor, sobbing into his trembling hands. The massive agent reached down and firmly grabbed my son by the back of his expensive tailored suit jacket, hauling him to his feet effortlessly like a misbehaving child. Julian offered absolutely no physical resistance. He hung entirely limp in the strong grip of the agent, his head bowed incredibly low, his shoulders shaking with pathetic, miserable sobs that echoed in the room. The federal agents adjusted their grips and began to firmly march them toward the heavy wooden door, preparing to take them out into the real, unforgiving world to finally face their absolute destruction. The federal agents absolutely did not do them the quiet professional favor of taking the discreet back exit or using the private service elevators hidden deeply behind the hospital cafeteria. They aggressively marched Sloane and Julian directly out of the small conference room and straight down the wide, brightly lit main hospital corridor for everyone to witness. They walked them purposefully right into the large glass public elevator that descended directly down into the massive, incredibly crowded main lobby of Emory University Hospital. It was a very busy weekday afternoon, and the grand open lobby was absolutely packed with hundreds of people. There were anxious visiting families, busy, exhausted doctors, administrative hospital staff, and wealthy hospital donors, all mingling closely near the large indoor coffee shop and the massive glass entrance doors. When the heavy elevator doors slid open, the sheer visual shock of the scene made the normal, loud, chaotic chatter of the massive lobby die down to a sudden, deeply hushed silence. Two large, serious federal agents, wearing dark tactical vests, were physically dragging a sharply dressed blonde woman and a black man in a luxury business suit straight through the exact center of the room. Every single curious eye in the massive lobby immediately turned to silently watch the incredible spectacle unfold. But fate had a perfectly cruel and deeply ironic sense of timing. Standing right near the bustling coffee shop, waiting patiently for their expensive iced lattes, were three of Sloane's most elite, snobby, and highly judgmental real estate clients. They were wealthy, high society socialites from the absolute richest and most exclusive suburbs of Atlanta, the exact kind of superficial people Sloane spent her entire adult life desperately trying to impress and emulate. They were the kind of wealthy women who hosted massive, expensive charity galas and exclusive gossip parties, women who held the absolute keys to Sloane's precious social standing and her highly lucrative professional career. They slowly turned around, holding their warm coffee cups, and watched in absolute, pure, unadulterated shock as their perfect luxury elite realtor was paraded right past them in cold, heavy steel chains. The exact moment Sloane made direct eye contact with her wealthy, important clients, her entire body completely locked up in sheer, absolute panic. The deep, burning, intense humiliation washed completely over her face, turning her pale, perfect skin a bright, glowing, and deeply embarrassed crimson. She desperately tried to raise her trembling hands to cover her face and hide her identity from the staring crowd. But the tight, heavy federal handcuffs kept her arms painfully pinned behind her back, leaving her entirely and completely exposed to the glaring, harsh judgment of the silent crowd. She violently turned her head to the side, letting her expensive, perfectly styled blonde hair fall forward over her eyes, desperately hoping to shield herself from the relentless stares, but it was completely and utterly useless. Everyone in that lobby knew exactly who she was. In that incredibly agonizing and terribly long walk across the expansive hospital lobby, Sloane finally realized the absolute terrifying totality of her complete destruction. Her entire fragile, arrogant identity had been built completely and entirely on the superficial opinions of the wealthy people currently staring at her. In a matter of mere seconds, her elite, untouchable social standing was instantly and permanently vaporized. Her highly lucrative and successful real estate career was permanently destroyed, because absolutely no one in the world would ever trust a federal convicted criminal who actively tried to murder her own elderly mother-in-law just to steal a commercial property deed. And most importantly, her precious physical freedom was entirely gone, forever replaced instantly by the terrifying, grim reality of a cold, lonely federal prison cell. Walking right beside her, Julian was faring even worse. He did not even try to proudly hide his face or maintain any shred of dignity. He simply walked with his chin resting heavily on his chest, weeping openly, loudly, and incredibly pathetically in front of hundreds of absolute strangers. He was a completely broken, shattered shell of a man entirely stripped of his false, unearned pride and his expensive banking executive ego. The wealthy socialites slowly pulled out their expensive smartphones, pointing the bright digital cameras directly at Sloane and Julian, recording every single miserable, humiliating second of their ultimate, absolute downfall to eagerly share with the rest of their wealthy, exclusive circle. I followed very slowly and quietly behind the federal agents, keeping a very safe and comfortable distance. I truly wanted to make absolutely certain that the terrible toxic cancer was completely and permanently removed from my family forever. I walked across the massive lobby, listening closely to the quiet, whispering crowd and the soft, pathetic, lingering sounds of my son crying in the distance. But as the heavy marching federal agents reached the massive revolving glass doors leading out to the busy hospital driveway, I finally stopped walking. Outside, in the bright, blinding afternoon sunlight, 3 large black federal law enforcement cruisers were parked illegally, directly against the concrete curb, with their bright red and blue emergency lights flashing brilliantly against the glass windows. I saw the strong federal agents push open the heavy glass doors, forcefully dragging Sloane and Julian out into the thick, oppressive Georgia heat. But I absolutely did not take another step forward. I did not walk outside into the bright sunlight to watch the federal agents forcefully push my weeping son into the dark, cramped, lonely back seat of a police car. I did not need or want to see the heavy steel doors slam shut, securely locking them inside their brand new, terrible reality. I had already seen more than enough. My deep, righteous justice had been fully and perfectly served. I stood there alone in the quiet lobby, took one long, deep breath of the cool, air-conditioned air, and turned my back on them forever. I physically and emotionally completely severed the deep blood tie to the cowardly boy I had lovingly raised and the vicious, greedy woman who had completely ruined him. I walked away from the bright, flashing police lights and headed straight back toward the bank of public glass elevators. I stepped inside a completely empty elevator car and firmly pressed the glowing button for the intensive care unit. The deeply exhausting and terrible battle for my money and my commercial property was finally and absolutely over. The greedy parasites were completely gone from our lives forever. But the real fight, the only beautiful fight that actually mattered in this entire world, was just beginning. I reached into my dark suit jacket pocket and felt the crisp, perfectly folded paper of the medical power of attorney resting safely and securely over my beating heart. The legal power to protect my family was finally back in my own rough hands. The doctors could no longer ignore my voice or dismiss my presence. I looked up at the digital numbers changing on the elevator screen, feeling a sudden massive surge of powerful, determined energy rushing through my old, tired veins. I had a beautiful, wonderful wife to save, and absolutely nothing on this earth was going to stop me. I walked out of the elevator and stepped back into the quiet, humming atmosphere of the intensive care unit. The heavy weight of the last few hours was completely gone from my shoulders, replaced by a fierce, burning determination. I walked straight up to the main nursing station and demanded to see the lead attending physician immediately. When the exhausted doctor stepped out into the hallway, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and frustration. He started to remind me that I had no legal authority to make medical decisions for my wife, and that he was still waiting for Julian to return. I did not let him finish his sentence. I reached inside my suit jacket and pulled out the crisp, freshly stamped medical power of attorney. I placed the legal document directly into his hands. I watched his tired eyes scan the red notary seal and the fresh signature. I told him in a voice that left absolutely no room for debate that I was back in charge of my wife's life. But I did not stop there. I knew that having legal authority was completely useless if the medical team did not know exactly what they were fighting. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. I had written down the exact chemical compound I discovered from Sloane's hidden digital receipts. I handed the paper to the doctor and looked him dead in the eyes. I told him they had been treating her for a natural heart attack and mysterious organ failure, but they were completely wrong. I told him my wife had been intentionally poisoned. I pointed to the paper and said the words black market potassium chloride. The doctor's eyes went completely wide. The sheer shock on his face was immediate. Potassium chloride in massive concentrated doses is incredibly lethal and mimics the exact symptoms of natural massive organ failure. It is the exact same chemical used in lethal injections to stop the human heart. The doctor realized in a fraction of a second that every single treatment they had given her over the last 2 days was completely ineffective against this specific aggressive poison. He looked down at the paper and then rushed back into the room. The entire atmosphere inside the intensive care unit shifted in an instant. The slow, quiet waiting game was completely over, replaced by a sudden, frantic burst of highly coordinated medical action. The attending physician shouted orders to the nursing staff, calling for an emergency nephrologist and specialized equipment. Now that they finally knew the exact name of the toxic enemy hiding inside her bloodstream, they could stop fighting blindly in the dark. The doctor quickly returned to my side and rapidly explained the new strategy. He said the lethal potassium chloride was aggressively binding to her cellular structures and completely shutting down her kidneys, making it impossible for her frail body to naturally filter out the poison. He told me they needed to initiate an incredibly high-risk targeted dialysis procedure immediately. They had to physically pump every single drop of her blood out of her body, run it through a massive specialized filtration machine to scrub the heavy chemical toxins away, and then pump the clean blood back into her failing heart. He warned me that the sudden drastic change in her blood volume and the intense physical strain of the heavy dialysis machine could easily trigger a fatal cardiac arrest. Her body was already so incredibly weak that the aggressive life-saving procedure itself might be the exact thing that finally kills her. He looked at me holding a new medical consent form and asked if I was absolutely sure I wanted to authorize such a massive risk. I did not hesitate for a single second. I grabbed the pen from his hand and signed my name with bold, heavy strokes. I told him my Gloria was a fighter and she would never give up without giving it absolutely everything she had. Within minutes, they wheeled a massive, humming dialysis machine into her small room. They connected thick, clear tubes to the major access ports in her neck and her arms. I stood in the corner of the room holding my breath as the machine was loudly powered on. I watched the dark red blood leave her body, traveling through the thick plastic tubing, entering the complex artificial filters. The room was filled with the loud, rhythmic pumping sound of the mechanical lifesaver. It was a brutal, terrifying process to witness. The doctors and nurses moved frantically around her bed, constantly adjusting the harsh chemical balances and monitoring the rapidly dropping numbers on the glowing screens. The deadly poison was finally being dragged out of her system, drop by painful drop. When the heavy medical team finally stabilized the massive dialysis machine and stepped out of the room, I was left completely alone with my wife. The real agonizing battle had just begun. The doctor told me it would take at least 24 grueling hours of continuous aggressive filtration to completely scrub the lethal potassium from her deeply damaged organs. I pulled a hard plastic chair directly up to the side of her hospital bed. I sat down and gently took her fragile, incredibly cold hand in mine. Her skin felt like thin, delicate paper, but I held on to her with all the strength I had left in my old, tired body. I refused to leave that uncomfortable chair. The nurses repeatedly came into the room begging me to go down to the cafeteria to eat a hot meal or go home to get a few hours of sleep. I completely ignored them. I was not going to let my wife fight the hardest battle of her entire life all by herself. I sat there in the dim light of the medical monitors, keeping a silent, fiercely devoted vigil over the only woman I had ever truly loved. The long, dark hours of the night slowly crept by. The loud, rhythmic pumping of the heavy dialysis machine became the only sound in my entire universe. Whenever the fear started to creep into my mind, I leaned in very close to her ear and softly began to whisper. I told her stories about our beautiful early days together. I talked about the incredibly hot summer we met in Chicago when I was just a young, sweaty man trying to find work, and she was a brilliant, beautiful young student reading books on the front porch. I reminded her of the tiny one-bedroom apartment we rented when we first moved down to Atlanta, with absolutely nothing but a few suitcases and a massive dream. I whispered about the countless long nights we stayed up together talking about the future while I studied complex electrical blueprints at the kitchen table, and she graded spelling tests for her students. I told her how she was the absolute foundation of my entire world, the only reason I ever worked so hard to build our beautiful life. I poured every single ounce of my deep, unconditional love directly into her, hoping my words would reach her through the deep, dark fog of the medical coma. I begged her to keep fighting. I told her the enemies were completely gone, and our home was finally safe again. I promised her that if she just opened her eyes, I would take care of her for the rest of our days. The heavy, agonizing night slowly faded into a dull gray morning and then stretched painfully into another incredibly long afternoon. My back was completely stiff and my eyes burned intensely from the lack of sleep, but I did not let go of her hand for a single second. I just kept watching the glowing monitors, praying for any small sign of a miracle. For the last 3 days, the green line of her heart monitor had been wildly erratic. It would spike dangerously high and then drop terrifyingly low, beeping with a weak, chaotic rhythm that constantly threatened to completely stop forever. But as the late afternoon sun finally began to shine softly through the small hospital window, something incredible happened. I was sitting there quietly rubbing my thumb across her knuckles when I suddenly realized the sound in the room was changing. The chaotic, weak beeping of the heart monitor was slowly shifting its pitch. I sat up perfectly straight, holding my breath and staring intensely at the glowing screen. The wild, jagged spikes on the green line were slowly smoothing out. The terrifying, erratic rhythm was gradually settling into a strong, steady, and completely even pace. Beep, beep, beep. It was the most beautiful, incredible sound I had ever heard. The massive dialysis machine had done its job. The deadly toxic poison had finally been washed out of her system, and her strong, resilient heart was eagerly taking back control of her fragile body. The heavy double doors of the room suddenly pushed open, and the lead attending physician walked inside. He was holding a new stack of laboratory blood test results in his hands. He looked down at the medical papers and then looked up at the glowing green monitor. He stepped quickly up to the side of her bed, pulling out his stethoscope and checking her vital signs. He checked her pulse, he checked her breathing, and he looked at the massive dialysis filters. Then the doctor slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. His tired eyes were incredibly wide, completely filled with absolute awe and sheer medical disbelief. He lowered his stethoscope and took a deep, trembling breath. 2 weeks had passed since the longest and most agonizing night of my entire life. I was sitting very quietly on a hard wooden bench in the very back row of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta. The room was incredibly imposing, with high vaulted ceilings and thick dark oak paneling that seemed to absorb all the sound and all the warmth from the air. It was a place specifically designed to make you feel incredibly small and entirely powerless before the absolute weight of the law. For the first time in my 75 years, I felt perfectly at home in a room exactly like this, because I was not the one on trial. I was wearing a simple, dark navy suit, holding my hands patiently in my lap, waiting for the heavy side doors to open. The last 14 days had been an absolute blur of constant medical updates and quiet hours spent holding Gloria's hand as she slowly and steadily regained her strength. She was finally breathing completely on her own, entirely free of the deadly chemical toxins and resting safely in a private rehabilitation room. Knowing she was safe allowed me to focus my entire mind on the final chapter of this terrible saga. The heavy wooden doors near the front of the courtroom suddenly clicked open, and a hush fell over the gallery. 2 armed federal marshals walked into the room, leading the prisoners toward the defense tables. My heart did not beat any faster when I saw them. I simply watched them walk with the cold, clinical detachment of a man inspecting the foundation of a demolished building. Sloan and Julian shuffled slowly into the bright, harsh lights of the courtroom. The incredibly satisfying reality of their absolute destruction was written all over their physical appearances. Sloan was not wearing a sharply tailored designer suit or an expensive silk blouse. She was swimming inside a standard-issue, oversized, bright orange prison jumpsuit. The heavy, coarse fabric made her look incredibly small and entirely insignificant. Her normally perfect blonde hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her face was pale, completely devoid of the expensive makeup she used to wear like a mask of superiority. Her wrists and ankles were bound by heavy metal chains that clinked loudly with every single step she took. Because of the massive $8 million Environmental Protection Agency lien she had so eagerly signed her name to, her entire financial world had been instantly vaporized. The federal government had aggressively frozen every single bank account she owned. They had seized her luxury vehicles and placed an ironclad lock on her beautiful suburban home. The sudden total loss of her wealth meant she could not afford the ruthless, expensive corporate lawyers she was so incredibly accustomed to. Instead of a high-priced legal shark standing next to her, she was forced to rely on a heavily overworked, deeply exhausted public defender who barely even looked at her when she sat down. Julian sat directly next to her wearing an identical orange jumpsuit, looking completely hollowed out. He kept his head bowed, staring at his shackled hands, refusing to look out into the gallery. He had lost his career, his reputation, and his freedom, all because he was too weak to stand up to the greedy woman sitting beside him. They were entirely stripped of the unearned wealth and arrogant privilege that had always protected them. They were finally forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world. The federal judge walked into the courtroom and took his seat high above the floor, looking down at the defense table with an expression of complete disgust. This was the official bail hearing to determine if Sloan and Julian would be allowed to wait for their criminal trial from the comfort of their own home, or if they would sit in a federal penitentiary. The federal prosecutor stood up and presented a completely devastating case to the judge. He did not mince his words or try to soften the terrible reality of their crimes. He described in intense, agonizing detail how Sloan had used her corporate real estate accounts and the federal mail system to illegally import a deadly chemical compound. He told the court how she had snuck into my dark kitchen and methodically poisoned an innocent elderly woman simply to accelerate a massive real estate inheritance. The judge listened quietly, reviewing the thick file containing the crystal-clear 4K video footage and the digital financial receipts I had provided. When the public defender weakly tried to argue that Sloan and Julian were respected members of the community who deserved to be granted bail, the judge immediately cut him off. The judge's voice boomed through the large courtroom, echoing off the heavy oak walls. He stated clearly that planning and executing the cold-blooded chemical poisoning of a sick, helpless family member for financial gain demonstrated a level of sheer malice and pure evil that he rarely saw in his courtroom. He looked directly at Sloan and told her that she was an extreme danger to society. He added that because they were currently facing massive, insurmountable federal debts and decades in prison, they were both massive flight risks. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. He raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a loud, resounding crack. Bail was categorically denied for both defendants. They were officially remanded to federal custody, where they would sit in a tiny concrete cell for months or even years until their criminal trial finally began. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was the absolute final nail in the coffin of their arrogant, privileged lives. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Sloan and Julian by the arms to lead them back through the heavy wooden doors and down into the dark holding cells below the courthouse. Julian stood up weakly, his shoulders shaking as he began to cry quietly once again, completely unable to handle the terrifying reality of his new life. But Sloan did not cry. As the marshal pulled her away from the defense table, she stopped resisting for just one fraction of a second and turned her head to look out into the gallery. She scanned the rows of wooden benches until her eyes locked directly onto mine. I sat perfectly still in the back row, meeting her gaze without a single ounce of fear or hesitation. Her eyes were completely filled with pure burning hatred and intense venomous rage that she could no longer hide behind fake smiles or passive-aggressive comments. But hiding right behind that intense hatred was the undeniable crushing look of absolute complete defeat. She looked at me and finally realized that the quiet old black man she had so deeply underestimated and constantly mocked had completely and utterly destroyed her. She had absolutely nothing left. No money, no status, no freedom, and no future. I did not smile at her. I did not wave or offer any kind of smug, victorious gesture. I simply looked deep into her completely broken eyes and gave her one single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement that the terrible debt had been fully paid and the natural order of our family had been permanently restored. Sloan opened her mouth to say something, but the marshal pulled hard on her heavy chains, dragging her roughly through the wooden doors. The doors clicked shut behind her, erasing her from my world forever. I took a deep, cleansing breath, stood up from the hard wooden bench, and walked slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom. I pushed open the heavy main doors of the building and stepped outside. The bright, warm Atlanta sunlight washed completely over my face. The sky was a brilliant, clear blue, and the air felt incredibly fresh and clean. I walked down the massive concrete steps of the federal courthouse, leaving the darkness and the betrayal permanently behind me. I had a beautiful wife waiting for me to come home. I drove my heavy truck back up the long, winding driveway leading to my estate. The tires crunched softly against the gravel, a steady, familiar sound that finally felt completely right. I parked the truck and stepped out into the warm afternoon air. The two sleek white luxury cars that had violated my front lawn 2 weeks ago were long gone, seized by the federal government and locked away in some dark impound lot. I walked up the stone steps and unlocked the heavy oak front door. When I stepped inside the grand foyer, I stopped and took a long, deep breath. The house was incredibly quiet, but it was a completely different kind of quiet than the one I had experienced a fortnight ago. Back then, the silence was incredibly heavy and oppressive, filled with the dark, creeping shadow of impending death and the toxic presence of greedy vultures waiting to pick my bones clean. Now the silence was incredibly pure. It was the deep, absolute peace of a house that had been completely cleansed of its sickness. The air felt lighter and much easier to breathe. I walked slowly through the living room, looking at the antique mahogany dining table and the imported Persian rugs that Sloane had so desperately tried to sell out from under me. They were no longer marked with the invisible price tags of her greedy, ambitious arrogance. They were just beautiful pieces of furniture, again resting safely in the home I had built with my own 2 hands. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the marble countertop where the terrible midnight crime had taken place. I had spent hours scrubbing that stone until my knuckles bled, erasing any physical trace of the deadly poison she had brought into our safe sanctuary. The kitchen was just a kitchen again, waiting patiently for Gloria to come home and bake her famous Sunday pies. The dark, heavy cloud that had suffocated my beautiful estate was permanently lifted, allowing the warm afternoon sunlight to pour through the tall glass windows and illuminate the tiny specks of dust dancing quietly in the air. My home was finally a fortress, once again secure, peaceful, and completely impenetrable. I walked out of the kitchen and made my way down the long hallway toward my private study. I opened the heavy wooden door and stepped into the quiet room where I handled all my most important financial affairs. I sat down behind my massive oak desk, resting my rough, calloused hands flat against the polished wood. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder containing my official last will and testament. I opened it and stared at the pages I had carefully drafted so many years ago. They were pages that were completely filled with blind, foolish hope. I had originally left absolutely everything: the blind trusts, the massive commercial real estate portfolios, the diverse stock investments, entirely to Julian. I had wanted him to have the absolute easiest, most comfortable life possible. I reached for my heavy gold pen, uncapped it, and firmly crossed out his name on every single page. It took only a few quick strokes of dark ink to completely erase him from my financial legacy, but the weight of that action felt incredibly heavy. He was officially and completely written out of my will forever. He would not receive a single dime of the massive empire I had bled for. Next, I pulled out a fresh stack of legal paper. I began drafting immediate instructions for my private wealth manager at Merrill Lynch. I ordered the total liquidation of a massive portion of my hidden liquid assets. I was taking millions of dollars directly out of the quiet offshore accounts and bringing them right back into the bright light. But this money was not going to be spent on luxury cars or expensive marble kitchen islands. I drafted the founding documents for a brand new, incredibly powerful, irrevocable trust fund. This massive trust was going to be completely dedicated to providing free, aggressive legal aid for elderly victims of financial abuse and physical neglect. I was going to use my vast resources to hire the absolute best, ruthless corporate litigators in the state to hunt down greedy relatives and manipulative caretakers who tried to steal from the vulnerable. I was building a massive financial war chest to ensure that no other elderly person in Atlanta would ever have to feel as helpless and cornered as I did in that terrible hospital hallway. I signed the documents, pressing the pen down so hard the ink bled through the thick paper, officially turning my private wealth into a public weapon for absolute justice. I set the pen down and leaned back in my heavy leather office chair, looking up at the ceiling. The quiet peace of the study allowed my tired mind to finally rest and reflect on the absolute totality of everything that had just happened. For my entire life, I had viewed my massive hidden wealth as a heavy, impenetrable shield. I grew up with absolutely nothing, working my fingers to the bone in highly dangerous electrical jobs just to put basic food on the table. When I finally started making real money, I became absolutely obsessed with building a massive financial fortress around my family. I wanted to make absolutely certain that my wife and my son would never have to experience the terrible, crushing weight of poverty. But sitting there in the quiet afternoon light, a dark, devastating epiphany washed completely over me. My money was never actually a shield for Julian. It was the exact toxic poison that had completely rotted his character from the inside out. By always quietly bailing him out of his terrible financial mistakes and maintaining his unearned, luxurious lifestyle, I had completely stripped away his ability to become a strong, resilient man. I had accidentally created a weak, pathetic coward who valued expensive Italian leather shoes more than the beating heart of his own mother. My blind, unconditional financial support had essentially paved the exact road that led his greedy, manipulative wife straight into my kitchen with a bottle of lethal poison. The crushing realization that my own hard work had indirectly funded my wife's near murder brought hot, bitter tears to my eyes. I wiped my face with the back of my rough hand, making a solemn, unbreakable vow right then and there. I was completely done hiding my money in the dark. I was completely done hoarding wealth just to feed a blind, foolish ego. For whatever remaining years God decided to give me on this earth, my money was going to be used purely for absolute righteous purpose. It was going to build shelters, fund critical medical research, and completely destroy the evil people who preyed on the weak. My legacy was no longer going to be measured by the square footage of my commercial properties or the massive balances in my hidden bank accounts. It was going to be measured by the amount of absolute good I could actively force into this broken world. I closed the leather folder and let out a long, slow breath, feeling the heavy burden of my terrible past finally fall completely away from my shoulders. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip slowly below the tree line outside my study window, casting long, deep orange shadows across the hardwood floor. I was just about to stand up and go into the kitchen to make myself a strong cup of black coffee when a sudden sharp sound shattered the perfect silence of the house. The heavy black landline phone sitting right on the corner of my oak desk began to ring loudly. The shrill, piercing electronic sound echoed violently off the walls, making my entire body jolt upright in the heavy leather chair. I stared at the phone as it rang a second time, the sound filling the room with a sudden, intense wave of pure, terrifying anxiety. I leaned forward and looked down at the small digital caller identification screen glowing brightly in the dimming light of the study. The bold black letters spelling out Emory University Hospital scrolled slowly across the tiny glass display. My heart instantly skipped a massive, heavy beat and seemed to completely stop right inside my chest. It had been 2 full weeks of slow, steady medical progress. Gloria was supposed to be completely safe now. She was supposed to be entirely out of danger and recovering in peace. But hospitals do not call the house line on a quiet Sunday evening just to deliver casual good news. I reached out with my right hand. My thick, calloused fingers were trembling slightly as I grasped the cold plastic receiver. I pulled the phone slowly off its base, holding it tightly to my ear and bracing my entire soul for whatever words were waiting for me on the other end of the line. I did not even wait to hear the voice on the other end of the line. The caller identification spelling out Emory University Hospital was all I needed to see. I dropped the heavy plastic receiver directly onto the polished wood of my desk, leaving it dangling by its coiled cord. I practically ran down the long hallway of my estate, moving with a sudden, desperate speed I did not know my 75-year-old legs still possessed. I grabbed my keys off the front table and threw open the heavy oak door, stepping out into the fading evening light. The drive back to downtown Atlanta was a complete blur. My large hands gripped the steering wheel of my truck so tightly my knuckles turned entirely pale. My heart was pounding frantically against my ribs, a heavy, desperate drumbeat echoing loud in my ears. I ignored the speed limits, weaving through the slow Sunday traffic with single-minded focus. Every single terrible possibility raced through my mind. Had the poison done some final hidden damage? Had her strong heart finally given out after fighting so hard? I pulled up to the emergency entrance, abandoned my truck near the sliding glass doors, and sprinted inside. I completely ignored the shouts of the valet attendants and the confused looks of the security guards. I pushed my way into the elevator, watching the glowing numbers climb upward, feeling like I was trapped underwater, holding my breath. When the doors finally opened on the recovery floor, I rushed down the long, quiet corridor. I did not knock or wait for a nurse. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to her private room, stepping inside with my chest heaving, preparing my soul for the absolute worst. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital room had been dimmed, replacing the harsh glare with a soft, warm, golden glow. I stood frozen in the doorway, completely paralyzed by the incredibly beautiful sight in front of me. The thick plastic tube that had been violently shoved down her throat for the last 2 weeks was completely gone. The heavy, terrifying mechanical breathing machine had been pushed away into the dark corner of the room, entirely silent. And there, lying against the crisp white hospital pillows, was my beautiful Gloria. Her eyes were open. They were tired and heavy, but they were open and they were looking directly at me. When she saw me standing there breathing heavily in the doorway, a slow, faint, incredibly beautiful smile spread across her face. It was the absolute greatest victory I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I walked toward her bed, my heavy work boots making soft sounds against the floor. I fell to my knees right beside her, burying my face gently against the edge of the mattress. I reached out and took her fragile, warm hand in mine, pressing it tightly to my lips. Hot, heavy tears streamed down my wrinkled cheeks, soaking into the white hospital sheets. I did not bother trying to hide my crying. For the first time in weeks, they were tears of pure, absolute joy, Malcolm, she whispered. Her voice was incredibly raspy and dry, cracking from the long days of forced silence, but to my ears it was the most perfect music ever created. I stood up and leaned over her, gently brushing the soft hair away from her forehead. She looked around the quiet room, her brow furrowing in slight confusion. She squeezed my fingers and asked me in a weak, fragile whisper where Julian was. She wanted to know why our son was not standing there waiting for her to wake up. I felt a brief, sharp sting in my chest, but I pushed it away immediately. I leaned down and pressed a long, tender kiss to her warm forehead. I looked deeply into her beautiful brown eyes and smiled, a completely genuine, peaceful smile. "He is gone, my love," I told her softly. "It is just us now, like it was in the beginning." She looked at me for a long moment, and somehow I think her heart already knew the absolute truth. She did not ask any more questions. She simply closed her eyes, squeezed my hand tightly, and drifted into a safe, natural, healing sleep. 6 long, beautiful months have passed since that incredible evening in the hospital. The brutal, punishing heat of the Atlanta summer has slowly given way to a cool, crisp, and incredibly vibrant autumn. I am walking slowly along the paved stone pathways of our large backyard, pushing Gloria gently in her comfortable wheelchair. She is wrapped in a thick wool blanket, breathing the fresh, clean air and smiling at the blooming flowers. She is getting stronger every single day, and the doctors say she will be walking on her own again very soon. Our estate is incredibly quiet, but it is filled with absolute peace. The toxic parasites that tried to destroy us were completely eradicated not by my own physical violence, but by the absolute heavy weight of their own disgusting greed. They are sitting in cold federal prison cells right now, completely stripped of their wealth and their arrogant pride, waiting for a trial they cannot possibly win. They tried to steal our future to pay for their superficial luxury, but all they did was hand me the exact tools I needed to permanently lock them away. I stop the wheelchair near the edge of the large koi pond and stand beside my wife, resting my hand gently on her shoulder. They looked at my gray hair and my black skin, and they saw an easy target. They saw a tired old man who was just a weak remnant of the past, completely unaware of the modern world. They thought I was a fool standing in the way of their incredible ambition. But they forgot one very simple and incredibly dangerous truth. They forgot that the heavy foundations built in the past by men who work with their bare hands are the only things strong enough to completely crush you when they finally fall. If there is one thing this nightmare has taught me, it is that blood does not automatically make someone family. Real family is built on mutual respect and unconditional loyalty, not inheritance and bank accounts. For decades, I thought my wealth was a protective shield for my son, but it was actually the poison that ruined his character. I learned that we must never allow our blind love to excuse terrible behavior. We have to stand up and protect what is right, even if it means walking away from the people we raised. True strength does not fade with age, it only grows wiser. Please share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know how you would have handled this situation. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more life stories.